Hey everyone, let's settle in for a story tonight. We're going to journey back in time to a place of sun-baked bricks and winding rivers where the world's first great code of laws was written not on paper but carved into stone for all to see. We often think of Hammurabi's code as a simple, almost primitive concept, an eye for an eye. It sounds straightforward, even fair, in a brutal sort of way. A system where every crime has an equal and opposite punishment, a perfect balance of justice and revenge. But the reality was far more complex and terrifying. It was less a balanced scale and more a web of social traps. Your life, your family, and your body were all collateral in a system that judged you based on who you were, not just what you did. So find a comfortable spot, dim the lights, and get settled. Let the noise of the modern world fade away for a little while. And let's ease into tonight's journey together, into the world of ancient Babylon, where justice could be swift, strange, and deadly. Imagine you live in this sprawling city of mud brick homes nearly 4,000 years ago. The air is thick with the smell of cooking fires and the dust from the street. You aren't a king or a priest. You are a simple builder, skilled with your hands. Your job is to build a house for a neighbor. It's a good commission. You gather the reeds, mix the clay, and lay the bricks under the hot Mesopotamian sun. You have a family to feed, and this work will provide for them for many months to come. On paper, the law is simple. Hammurabi's Code, number 229, has a clear guideline for your profession. It states that if a builder builds a house and does not make his work strong, and the house he has built collapses and kills the owner, then that builder shall be put to death. This seems harsh, but logical. A life for a life, a direct consequence for a fatal error. You are confident in your work. You've built dozens of homes just like this one. You've finished the job. Collect your payment in grain and silver and go home to your family. But a few weeks later, a terrible storm rolls in. The winds howl and the rain falls in sheets. In the middle of the night, you are woken by panicked shouts. The house you just finished building has collapsed. The owner is safe, but his son was not so lucky. Now, the law is no longer a simple abstract concept on a stone pillar. It is at your door. The city guards arrive, their faces grim. You are taken before the judges, and the owner of the house, his eyes filled with grief, points a shaking finger directly at you. You didn't intend for this to happen. It was a storm, a tragic accident. But the law doesn't care about your intentions. The house you built was not strong enough. The code is absolute. You are a builder, and a death occurred because of your work. You brace yourself for the worst, expecting the guards to lead you to your own execution. A life for a life, as the code dictates. But the judge reads a different law, one that follows the first. He reads law number 230, and the blood drains from your face. This law says something else entirely. It says if the collapsed house kills the owner's son, then the builder's son shall be put to death. Suddenly the crime is not just yours. The debt is not to be paid with your own life. It will be paid by your child. This wasn't justice as we know it. This was a terrifying balancing of the cosmic scales. The grieving father had lost a son, so you had to lose one too. Your failure as a craftsman had a consequence that would echo through your own family, a pain designed to match another's. Your son, who had nothing to do with mixing the clay or laying the bricks, is now the payment for your mistake. He is the price of a poorly constructed wall. This was the brutal reality of Hammurabi's code. It wasn't always an eye for your eye. Sometimes, it was a son for a son, a daughter for a daughter. The law saw people not as individuals, but as assets, as parts of a household. And if one household was damaged, another had to be damaged in precisely the same way to restore balance. This principle extended to property as well. If the collapse killed the owner's slave, you didn't die. You simply had to give the owner a slave of equal value. A person's life was measured against another's station. Justice was anything but blind. It was obsessed with status. The builder's story is a chilling reminder that in Babylon, you are responsible not just for your own actions, but for the devastating ripples they could create. The weight of your work fell not just on your shoulders, but on the shoulders of the people you loved the most. It makes our modern building codes and insurance policies seem like a gentle comfort. A lawsuit or a fine is one thing, but the fear that a miscalculation at work could lead to the loss of your own child is a pressure we can barely comprehend today. But the intricate and often cruel logic of the code didn't stop with builders. Every profession had its own set of high-stakes rules. Let's leave the dusty construction site and step into another world, one that was just as vital to Babylonian life, the world of medicine. Imagine now that you are a physician in Babylon. You don't have a sterile white office. You work in a bustling marketplace or a quiet temple courtyard. Your tools are not polished steel, but sharpened bronze knives and obsidian shards. Your knowledge comes from clay tablets passed down for generations. People come to you for everything from broken bones to raging fevers. Your job is a respected one. Healers were essential members of the community, and you take pride in your ability to ease suffering and mend the human body. But your work carries an incredible risk. One day, a wealthy nobleman comes to you. He is an awilam, a member of the highest class of Babylonian society. He has a cataract, a clouding of his eye that is slowly stealing his sight. He wants you to perform a delicate surgery to fix it. The procedure is risky. With a small bronze lancet, you must make a precise incision to clear the man's vision. If you succeed, the nobleman will be able to see again. Your reputation will grow, and according to Law 215, he will pay you 10 shekels of silver. That's a fortune. It's enough silver to live comfortably for a very long time. The reward is immense. But as you prepare your tools, you are keenly aware of the other side of that law. You know the penalty for failure is not just a disappointed patient. You steady your hand. The nobleman lies still as you lean in, the bronze tool glinting in the light. The entire procedure hinges on a few millimeters of movement. Your patient's future, his ability to see the world, rests on your skill, but so does your own future. Let's say something goes wrong. A slight tremor in your hand, an unexpected flinch from the patient, or maybe the healing just doesn't go as planned. The operation is a failure. Not only is the man's vision not restored, but you have accidentally destroyed the eye completely. The nobleman is now blind in one eye because of you. The consequences are immediate and horrifying. According to Law 218, the penalty is not a fine. It is not a loss of your medical license. The law states, "They shall cut off his hands." Your hands, the very tools of your trade, the source of your livelihood, would be taken from you. It was a punishment designed to be both symbolic and final. You could never again practice medicine. You could never again harm a patient of high status. This single, brutal rule transformed the act of healing into a terrifying gamble. Every time a surgeon picked up a knife to operate on a nobleman, they were quite literally placing their own hands on the line. The pressure must have been almost unbearable. But here's where the story gets even more revealing about Babylonian society. The law was not about protecting all patients equally. It was about protecting the assets of the powerful. The value of a person's body was tied directly to their social class. Let's change one simple fact in our story. Your patient is not a nobleman. He is a mashkenim, a commoner or freeman. He's not at the bottom of society, but he is not at the top either. He has the same eye problem, and you attempt the same surgery. Again, the operation fails. You make a mistake, and the commoner loses his eye. He is just as blind as the nobleman was in our first story. The physical outcome is identical, but the legal consequence for you, the surgeon, is dramatically different. You do not lose your hands. Instead, Law 219 kicks in. It states you must pay 1 mina of silver. It's a hefty fine, to be sure, a significant financial blow. But your body remains whole. You can still work, still earn a living, still practice your craft. The message was crystal clear. The eye of a nobleman was worth a surgeon's hands. The eye of a commoner was worth a sum of money. The person's physical well-being was secondary to their status. Justice was a sliding scale, weighted heavily in favor of the elite. Now, let's take it one step further down the social ladder. Imagine your patient is not a nobleman or a commoner. He is a slave, the property of another man. His health matters, but only because it affects his ability to work for his master. You are called by the slave's owner to perform the same eye surgery. Once again, you fail. The slave is now blind in one eye. He can no longer perform his duties as effectively. His value as a piece of property has just decreased significantly. The law that applies here is number 220. It's even more revealing. It states that if you destroy the eye of a slave, you shall pay 1/2 of his value in silver to his master. Notice who gets the payment. Not the man who lost his eye, but his owner. The slave himself is not considered the victim of the crime. The victim is the slave's owner, who has suffered a financial loss. The slave's body was simply a damaged asset, like a cracked pot or a lame ox. Your penalty was just the cost of repairs. So for the exact same medical mistake, there were 3 wildly different outcomes. Blinding a nobleman cost you your hands. Blinding a commoner cost you a fine. Blinding a slave meant you simply paid for the damaged property. This wasn't a system of justice, it was a system of price tags. This class-based structure ran through the entire code. A nobleman who struck another nobleman in a fight would face one penalty, but if that same nobleman struck a commoner, the penalty was just a small fine. The law protected the powerful from each other and from everyone else. This intricate system of laws governed every aspect of daily life, from professional conduct to family matters. And it's within the family that some of the most personal and severe laws took effect, reinforcing a rigid social order where respect for authority was absolute. Let's shift our perspective again. You are no longer a builder or a doctor. You are a young man, a son living in your father's house. Life is structured and predictable. Your father is the head of the household, and his authority is backed by the full force of the law. In most societies, family disputes are handled privately. A disobedient son might be punished by his parents, but it rarely becomes a legal matter for the state. In Babylon, however, the family structure was a pillar of society, and the law guarded it fiercely. Law 195 is short, simple, and utterly shocking to our modern minds. It states, "If a son has struck his father, they shall cut off his hand." There are no exceptions. No mention of the circumstances, no consideration of why the son might have done it. The act itself was the crime. Striking your father was seen as an attack on the natural order of the world. It was an unforgivable act of rebellion against the authority that governed not just your family, but the entire kingdom. The punishment was swift and permanent. This law wasn't about preventing injury. It was about enforcing a hierarchy. The father's power was absolute, and any physical challenge to it was met with a mutilation that served as a lifelong public mark of shame and disobedience. You would forever be the son who struck his father. But what about other kinds of accusations? The ones that were harder to prove? What happened when it was one person's word against another's, with no witnesses and no clear evidence? For these situations, the code had one of its most infamous and terrifying solutions. Let's imagine a new scenario. You are a woman living in a small village on the banks of the Euphrates River. You are married. One day, a neighbor, perhaps out of jealousy or malice, publicly accuses you of adultery. It's a devastating accusation, one that could destroy your life. The problem is, there is no proof. It is simply his word against yours. In our world, the case might be dismissed for lack of evidence, but in Babylon, The law could not tolerate uncertainty, and so it turned to a higher power for judgment, the river itself. This was the trial by ordeal, a legal mechanism that appears utterly alien to us today. It was based on the profound belief that the natural world, and specifically the rivers, were controlled by the gods. The Euphrates River was not just a body of water, it was the home of a powerful deity who could see the truth in a human heart. When a person was cast into the river, it was a direct appeal to this divine judge. The logic was simple and terrifying. An innocent person would be protected by the river god and would float, while a guilty person would be claimed by the river and sink to their death. It removed the burden of proof from human hands and placed it squarely in the realm of the supernatural. For the woman accused of adultery, this meant her fate rested not on the testimony of witnesses or the skill of a lawyer, but on the currents of the water and the whim of a god she could only pray to. Imagine the scene on the riverbank. It wouldn't have been a private affair. The entire community would gather to watch the divine judgment unfold. The accuser would be there, his face a mask of certainty, standing beside the woman's husband, who would be torn between shame, doubt, and fear. The accused woman would be led to the water's edge, her hands possibly bound, her mind racing. This wasn't just a trial. It was a public spectacle, a piece of civic theater designed to reinforce the power of the gods and the seriousness of the law. Every eye would be on her as she approached the murky water. The silence would be heavy, broken only by the lapping of the waves and the whispers of the crowd. Her reputation, her marriage, and her very life were all about to be decided in a single, heart-stopping moment of submersion, a test from which there was no appeal. The moment she is pushed or thrown into the river is the ultimate act of surrender. The shock of the cold water, the desperate gasp for air, the struggle against the current, none of it matters in the eyes of the law. Her skill as a swimmer is completely irrelevant. The community isn't waiting to see if she can save herself. They are waiting for a sign from the divine. If she sinks beneath the surface and does not reappear, it is taken as an irrefutable admission of guilt. The river god has claimed her. Her life is over, her name is disgraced, and the matter is considered legally closed. Furthermore, according to Law 132, her accuser is then entitled to take possession of her house. Guilt didn't just mean death. It meant the complete erasure of her existence and the transfer of her worldly goods to the man who condemned her. But what if the opposite happens? What if, against the pull of the current and the weight of her clothes, she floats? This is seen as a miracle, a clear and undeniable sign of her innocence. The river god has rejected the accusation and protected her. She would be pulled from the water, dripping and gasping, but vindicated in the eyes of everyone. She is declared pure, her honor is restored, and she can return to her husband without a stain on her character. For her, the ordeal is over. But for the man who accused her, the ordeal is just beginning. The law of Hammurabi was obsessed with balance, and a false accusation that risked a person's life was considered a crime just as serious as murder. The divine judgment of the river didn't just apply to the accused, it recoiled back onto the accuser with deadly force. This is where the brutal genius of the code reveals itself. With the woman declared innocent, the focus now shifts entirely to the man who made the claim. Law number 2 of the code is invoked, one of the very first and most important principles. If a man has accused another of witchcraft, but has not proved it, the accused shall go to the sacred river, and if the river overcomes him, his accuser shall take his house. If the sacred river declares him innocent, his accuser shall be put to death. Though this law mentions sorcery, the principle applied to other life or death accusations like adultery. The man who risked a woman's life with his words now had to forfeit his own. He would be executed, and the wrongly accused woman's husband would be entitled to take possession of the false accuser's house. This made making a serious accusation an incredibly high-stakes gamble. You had better be absolutely sure, because if the river god disagreed with you, you would pay the ultimate price. This system of trial by ordeal feels barbaric to us, a terrifying coin flip for justice. Yet in its own way, it served as a powerful social glue. It discouraged casual slander and baseless accusations, forcing people to think very carefully before they pointed a finger. It outsourced the most difficult and divisive legal decisions to an unquestionable authority, the gods, preventing endless cycles of recrimination and revenge between families. It was a legal system built on a foundation of profound fear: fear of the gods, fear of the river, and fear of your neighbor's accusations. In the world of Hammurabi, justice was not about finding the facts, but about maintaining cosmic balance, even if it meant throwing people into a river to see if they would float. But not all disputes were so dramatic. Most of Babylonian life revolved around something far more earthly: business. Let's imagine you are a woman in Babylon, but instead of being a wife in a domestic dispute, you are an entrepreneur. One of the most common and respectable businesses a woman could run was a tavern. These weren't dark, sordid places. They were bustling hubs of the community. Your tavern, run out of your own home, would be filled with farmers, merchants, and off-duty soldiers, all gathering to drink the nutritious staple beverage of Mesopotamia, beer. You, the alewife or taverness, were a respected figure, providing a vital service to the neighborhood. You manage your inventory of barley, brew the beer, serve your customers, and maintain order. It seems like a straightforward and honest way to make a living, a simple matter of commerce and hospitality in a thriving city. But under Hammurabi's code, your job came with a terrifying hidden responsibility. The common sense assumption would be that you are responsible for the quality of your beer and for getting paid, nothing more. What your customers discuss is their own business. But in the eyes of the Babylonian state, a place where people gathered to drink and talk was a potential breeding ground for trouble. The authorities were deeply suspicious of any private gathering they did not control. Your tavern wasn't just a business, it was a potential hotbed of sedition, conspiracy, and criminal activity. The king could not place a guard in every tavern, so the law did something much more effective. It turned you, the owner, into an unwilling agent of state security, making you legally responsible for the words and deeds of every person who walked through your door. The reality of your situation is laid out in Law Number 109. It states that if, quote, conspirators assemble in the house of a tavern keeper, and she does not seize them and bring them to the palace, that tavern keeper shall be put to death. Think about what this means in practice. You are serving beer, trying to run your business, and you overhear a group of men in the corner muttering angrily about a new tax or a corrupt local official. Is this just harmless grumbling, the kind of talk that happens in bars all over the world? Or is it the beginning of a genuine plot against the authorities? The law forces you to make that judgment call, and if you get it wrong, the penalty is your own life. You are compelled to become an informant against your own customers, straining the bonds of trust with the very community you serve. Picture your tavern on a busy night. The air is thick with smoke and the noise of dozens of conversations. Two merchants are arguing over a price, a group of soldiers are telling loud stories, and in the corner, a few farmers are complaining that the governor is demanding too much of their harvest. You catch a few of their angry words. Do you stop everything, grab the city guards, and accuse them of treason? If you do, and they were just venting, you've alienated your customers and possibly made dangerous enemies. But if you ignore it, and they really are plotting something, you could be executed for your silence. This law created a chilling atmosphere of suspicion. It turned places of community gathering into extensions of the state's surveillance network, ensuring that the king's authority was felt even in the most casual settings. This legal obligation would have fundamentally changed the nature of your relationship with your patrons. You could no longer be just a friendly host. You had to be a vigilant observer, constantly listening, evaluating, and weighing the risk of every overheard conversation. It creates a society where people are afraid to speak their minds, even in private, for fear that the person serving them their drink is legally required to report them to the authorities. The tavern, instead of being a refuge from the pressures of daily life, becomes another source of anxiety. Your loyalty was not to your customers or your community, but first and foremost to the palace. Failure to demonstrate that loyalty, even through simple negligence, was a capital crime. And the social regulations didn't stop with politics. Your role as a taverness also made you a moral enforcer. Law 110 placed another heavy burden on you, this time related to religious protocol. It concerned certain classes of priestesses who were expected to live in a cloister, separate from public life. The law states that if such a priestess, quote, opens a tavern or enters a tavern for a drink, they shall burn that woman. This in itself is a harsh punishment. But the law was not just aimed at the priestess. The responsibility for enforcing her seclusion fell partly on you. If you, the tavern owner, served her, you were seen as complicit in her transgression, and you could face a similarly brutal punishment for allowing her to break her vows within your establishment. Ultimately, being a business owner in Babylon, especially in a public-facing role like a taverness, was about far more than just balancing your books. It was a constant, high-stakes negotiation with the state. You were responsible for the political loyalty, the moral conduct, and the good behavior of your customers. Your business license was conditional on your willingness to act as the eyes and ears of the government. One overheard plot, one forbidden customer, or one moment of poor judgment could lead not to a fine or a business closure, but to a brutal execution. If the law was this merciless with business owners, you can only imagine how it treated those who took what wasn't rightfully theirs. Let's now consider the crime of theft. In almost every society, taking someone else's property is against the law, but the punishments can vary wildly, from a warning to a prison sentence. In Hammurabi's Babylon, the consequence for stealing was not a simple, one-size-fits-all penalty. It was a complex calculation that depended on three crucial factors: what you stole, who you stole it from, and, most importantly, your own personal wealth. The law was less concerned with the moral wrong of stealing and more concerned with the economic disruption it caused. Justice was, once again, a matter of restoring balance to the system, and the methods for doing so were designed to be terrifyingly clear and unforgiving for those at the bottom of the social ladder. Imagine you are a poor farmer. A blight has ruined your crops, and your family has not eaten in days. In a moment of desperation, you sneak into your wealthier neighbor's field at night and take one of his goats, thinking you can feed your children and perhaps sell the hide. It's a crime born of necessity, not malice, but you are clumsy, and a watchman catches you as you try to lead the animal away. You are brought before the city judges, the stolen goat serving as undeniable proof of your guilt. You expect a punishment, perhaps a beating or being forced to work off the debt, but the judge begins to recite the law, and you quickly realize your situation is far more perilous than you could have ever imagined. The judge turns to law number 8 of the Great Code. This law meticulously outlines the penalties for stealing livestock. It states that if the goat you stole belonged to a temple or the palace, the two most powerful institutions in the land, you would be required to pay back 30 times its value. If, as in your case, it belonged to a commoner, the penalty was still a staggering 10-fold repayment. This was not about simple restitution. It was a punitive fine designed to make theft an economically disastrous choice. The owner would not only get his goat back, but would profit immensely from your crime. For a wealthy person caught stealing, this might be a manageable, though painful, financial blow. But for you, a poor farmer, it is an impossible sum. And this is where the law reveals its cruelest edge. The final clause of law number 8 states, "If the thief does not have anything to pay, he shall be put to death." Your poverty is not a mitigating factor. It is the very thing that condemns you. Two men could commit the exact same crime, stealing the exact same goat from the exact same field, and receive two completely different sentences. The wealthy thief pays a fine and walks away, his life intact. You, the poor thief, are executed. Justice was not blind. It stared directly at your wallet. The system was designed to protect the property of the haves from the desperation of the have-nots. and it did so by making the penalty for poor thieves the ultimate one. Now, let's alter the scenario slightly to see how the location of the crime changed everything. Forget the goat in the field. Imagine that same hungry man, instead of stealing from an open pasture, decides to force his way into his neighbor's house to steal grain. The act of breaking and entering was considered a far more severe violation than simple theft. It was an attack on the sanctity and security of the home, a sacred space in Babylonian society. For this crime, the law was even more specific and gruesome. Law 21 says, "If a man breaks into a house, he shall be put to death before that breach and be walled up in it." This was not just an execution, it was a horrifying form of public art. Try to visualize this punishment. The thief would be killed right at the spot where he broke through the wall. Then, the builders would come and seal his body into the very hole he had created. He would become a permanent part of the structure he had violated. His tomb would be the wall of his victim's house, a grotesque and constant reminder to everyone in the neighborhood about the price of such a crime. This wasn't just about punishment, it was about deterrence in its most visceral form. Every time the homeowner, his family, or his neighbors walked past that spot, they would be reminded of the thief and the terrible finality of Babylonian justice. The home's security system was, in the most literal sense, built from the bodies of those who dared to breach it. The hierarchy of theft reached its peak with the most sacred places of all, the temples. Stealing from a god was considered the ultimate act of sacrilege, an offense not just against the community, but against the entire cosmic order. According to Law Number 6, if a man stole property belonging to a god or the court, he was to be put to death. There was no option for a fine here, regardless of how wealthy the thief might be. The crime was absolute, and so was the punishment. Furthermore, the law extended its reach to anyone who might have been complicit. It clearly states that the one who receives the stolen goods from his hand shall also be put to death. This closed any potential loophole, making it just as deadly to buy stolen sacred goods as it was to steal them in the first place. In the world of Hammurabi, property was not just a personal possession. It was a reflection of the social and divine order. A goat was not just a goat. It was an asset whose value was defined by its owner's status. A home was not just a shelter. It was a fortress, protected by the most terrifying laws. And a temple was not just a building. It was a divine treasury, where theft was an insult to the gods themselves. The legal code didn't just punish theft, it created a landscape of fear, with punishments so brutal and so symbolically potent that they were designed to haunt the thoughts of anyone who might be tempted to take what was not theirs. While the law came down hard on these intentional acts, it was just as unforgiving when it came to negligence, especially during a crisis. Life in a densely packed ancient city was filled with daily hazards, but few were more terrifying than fire. The houses were built from highly flammable materials like mud brick, wood, and reeds, and a single stray spark could quickly escalate into a neighborhood-destroying inferno. Because of this constant threat, firefighting was not the job of a specialized few. It was a collective, civic duty. When the alarm was raised, every able-bodied citizen was expected to rush to the scene and help extinguish the flames. This communal responsibility was essential for survival, and the law of Hammurabi went to extreme lengths to ensure that nobody would dare to take advantage of the chaos for personal gain. It policed not just actions, but intentions. So imagine you are a soldier, respected and known in your community. One hot, dry afternoon, screams of "Fire!" erupt down the street. A neighbor's house is ablaze, and you do what is expected of you. You run towards the danger, joining the frantic bucket brigade, helping to evacuate the family, and working to stop the flames from spreading to the adjacent homes. In this moment, you are a model citizen, performing a heroic and necessary duty. The smoke is thick, the heat is intense, and everyone is focused on the singular goal of saving the home and the neighborhood. You are acting on instinct, a part of a desperate, unified effort. But in the middle of this chaos, temptation appears, and with it, one of the code's most diabolical laws. As you help carry furniture out of the burning house, you notice the homeowner's property scattered in the street. Amid the confusion, your eye is drawn to a small, ornate silver box that has fallen from a chest. No one else seems to have noticed it. For a split second, a thought flashes through your mind. You could easily slip it into your tunic. Who would ever know? In the panic of the fire, it could simply be reported as lost to the flames. You are a soldier who has risked your life for the city. Perhaps you deserve a small reward. It is a fleeting, opportunistic thought. But this exact thought, this momentary flicker of greed, is precisely what Law Number 25 was written to prevent. It is a law aimed directly at you, the would-be hero. The law is terrifyingly specific and direct. It reads, if a fire breaks out in a man's house and a man who has come to extinguish it casts his eye upon the property of the owner of the house and takes the property of the owner of the house, that man shall be thrown into that same fire. The punishment is a perfect, poetic, and horrifying reflection of the crime. You came to fight the fire, but you used the disaster as a cover for theft. Therefore, you will become fuel for the very flames you were supposed to extinguish. There is no trial, no fine, no appeal. Your crime is self-evident, and your sentence is to be carried out on the spot. It is one of the most brutal examples of symmetrical justice in the entire code. This law does more than just punish looting. It powerfully reinforces the sacred trust required between neighbors in a moment of crisis. When your house is on fire, you need to believe, without any doubt, that the people rushing to help you have only one intention: to save you and your home. You cannot be worried that they are also looking for opportunities to steal your possessions. Law 25 ensures this trust by making the penalty for violating it so immediate and so ghastly that it would likely never be worth the risk. It purifies the act of helping, stripping it of any possible ulterior motive. The message is simple. In an emergency, we are all in this together, and anyone who betrays that social contract will be consumed by the crisis itself. This shows that Hammurabi's code was not just a list of rules. It was an attempt to engineer a society's behavior on a deep psychological level. It understood that emergencies could bring out both the best and the worst in people. By creating such a visceral and direct punishment, the law aimed to eliminate the worst impulses before they could even take root. In Babylon, the first responders were held to the most extreme standard of accountability imaginable. Misconduct didn't result in a suspension or a desk job. It resulted in you becoming a part of the very disaster you were there to fight. A grim lesson for anyone else who might see a crisis as an opportunity. The laws of Babylon governed every part of public and professional life with an iron fist, from the integrity of a firefighter to the chatter in a tavern. But the code's reach did not stop at the doorway of the home. It went right inside, inserting itself into the most private and personal aspects of human existence. It laid down the rules for love, marriage, divorce, and family life, with the same rigid, contractual logic it applied to business and crime. In the eyes of the law, a family was the fundamental building block of the state, and its stability was far too important to be left to the unpredictable emotions of individuals. Marriage was not a romantic union. It was the most important contract a person would ever enter. Let's step into the world of a Babylonian family. Marriage was, first and foremost, a financial arrangement. When a man and woman married, it was the culmination of a negotiation between their two families. The bride's father would provide a dowry, money, land, or goods, which was a form of pre-mortem inheritance that the bride would bring with her into the marriage. In turn, the groom's family would pay a bride price to the bride's father, compensating him for the loss of his daughter. Once these contracts were settled and written down on a clay tablet, the marriage was legally binding. It was a merger of two family businesses designed to produce heirs, consolidate wealth, and ensure social stability. Romance might be a welcome bonus, but it was certainly not a legal requirement. We often carry a pop culture image of ancient societies as places where women were mere property with no rights at all. And while Babylonian society was deeply patriarchal, with the husband holding ultimate authority, the code is surprising in the specific legal and financial protections it granted to wives. These protections were not based on modern ideas of equality, but on the contractual nature of marriage. A woman, particularly through her dowry, was a significant financial asset. The law, therefore, sought to protect that asset and ensure that a husband could not act with complete and total impunity. A wife had specific, legally enforceable rights that a man was required to honor, especially when it came to the dissolution of the marriage contract through divorce. For a man, divorcing his wife was a relatively straightforward process, but it could be an expensive one. The law made a clear distinction based on whether the wife had fulfilled her primary duty, bearing children. According to Law 138, if a man chose to divorce his wife after she had given him sons, he was legally obligated to do two things. First, he had to return her dowry to her in its entirety. Second, he had to give her custody of the children and provide her with a portion of his property, from his field, garden, and goods, sufficient to raise them. He could not simply cast her and his children out into the street to fend for themselves. He had a continuing financial responsibility to the family he was choosing to break apart. The financial disincentive to divorce was even stronger if the couple was childless. In this case, Law 139 applied. The husband still had to return his wife's dowry in full. But in addition to that, he had to pay her a sum of silver equal to the original bride price he had paid her father years ago. In essence, he had to buy his way out of the marriage contract, refunding both sides of the original financial transaction. This could represent a significant financial loss, and it served as a powerful check on a man's ability to divorce his wife for frivolous reasons. Before making the decision, he would have to ask himself, is my dissatisfaction with this marriage worth the considerable cost of ending it? However, this legal protection for women was entirely conditional on their behavior, which the law defined in very narrow terms. The pendulum swung violently in the other direction if the wife was deemed to be at fault. Law 141 describes a scenario where a wife has set her face to go out and has acted extravagantly, has wasted her house, and has belittled her husband. These accusations, basically of being a poor manager of the household and being publicly disrespectful, were taken extremely seriously. If her husband could prove these charges before the community leaders, his options were stark. He could divorce her on the spot, and, in this case, he owed her nothing. He would not have to return her dowry or pay any kind of settlement. She would be sent away in disgrace with nothing. But the husband had another, even crueler option under Law 141. He was not required to divorce his misbehaving wife. He could choose to keep her in his house, but her status would be permanently altered. He could take a second wife, a new primary wife, who would assume all the duties and privileges of the household. The first wife, the one who had belittled him, would be forced to remain in the same home, but now in the legal position of a slave to the new wife. Her punishment for stepping outside her prescribed social role was a complete and total loss of her freedom and status, a daily humiliation enacted under her own roof. This law powerfully illustrates the limits of a woman's autonomy. Her financial security was directly tied to her obedience and proper conduct. Given this power imbalance, what recourse did a woman have? Could a wife initiate a divorce? It was exceptionally difficult and rare. She could not divorce her husband simply because he was cruel, lazy, or unfaithful. Her only real legal grounds were severe neglect or public humiliation by him. Law 142 outlines a scenario where a woman is blameless, but her husband has greatly belittled her. If she declares that, "You may not have me," her case would be investigated by the local authorities. If the investigation proved that she was circumspect and has no fault, but that her husband had been going out and greatly belittling her, she was free to go. She could take her dowry and return to her father's house, her reputation and finances intact. This law is remarkable because it acknowledges that a woman's reputation and dignity have legal value. A husband could not publicly and consistently degrade his wife without consequence. However, the law had a sting in its tail. If the investigation found that the woman was not circumspect but had been gadding about, wasting her house, and belittling her husband, then the consequences were dire. She was not granted a divorce. Instead, that woman shall be thrown into the water. This meant that a wife's attempt to leave a bad marriage was a life-or-death gamble. If the court sided with her, she was free. If they sided with her husband, she was executed by drowning. It was a powerful deterrent that ensured only the most desperate or the most demonstrably innocent wives would dare to initiate such proceedings. The intricate legal framework of marriage in Babylon was designed to create stable, economically productive family units. It achieved this not through promoting love or happiness, but by enforcing a strict set of duties and consequences. A man's freedom to divorce was tempered by financial penalties. A woman's legal protection was conditional upon her adherence to a rigid code of conduct. The laws show a society that, while deeply patriarchal, recognized a wife's economic contribution and offered her certain contractual rights. But it also shows a society that would punish a woman with enslavement or death for behavior that was seen as a threat to her husband's authority and the stability of the home. This legal logic created some very specific and strange situations, especially when illness entered the picture. Imagine a Babylonian man who is happily married. His wife is a good household manager, and they have built a life together. But then, she is struck by a serious chronic illness, perhaps a form of paralysis, epilepsy, or a wasting disease that leaves her incapacitated. In an age without effective medicine, this condition could be permanent. The husband now faces a major personal and societal problem. He has a duty to care for his sick wife, but he also has a duty to produce heirs to inherit his property and continue the family line. His ill wife may no longer be able to bear children. The Code of Hammurabi provided a very specific and surprisingly nuanced solution to this delicate and tragic problem. The law did not force the man to choose between his sick wife and his need for an heir. Instead, Law 148 offered a compromise. It states that if a man's wife is afflicted with a disease, he has the right to marry a second wife. This acknowledges the practical necessity of continuing his lineage. However, the law placed a crucial restriction on him. He shall not divorce his wife whom the disease has seized. He was legally forbidden from casting her aside because of her illness. More than that, the law stipulated that, quote, "She shall dwell in the house he has built, and he shall support her as long as she lives." He had a lifelong legal obligation to provide care, food, and shelter for his first wife, even after bringing a new wife into the home. This law demonstrates a remarkable degree of social responsibility for the time. It is a pragmatic and, in its own way, compassionate rule. It prevents a woman from being made destitute and homeless simply because she fell ill. Her past contributions to the marriage and household are legally recognized, earning her the right to be cared for in her time of need. It balances the husband's societal need for an heir with his personal duty to his sick partner. The home would now contain a complex family structure. A husband, his new, healthy wife, and his first ailing wife, all living together under one roof, with their roles and responsibilities clearly defined by the law of the land. But the law also recognized that this living arrangement might be emotionally unbearable for the sick wife. Having to watch her husband build a new life with a new woman in her own home could be a source of constant pain and humiliation. In recognition of this, the code offered her an alternative, a way to preserve her dignity. Law 149 states that if the sick wife is not pleased to dwell in her husband's house, she is not forced to stay. The husband is then legally obligated to repay to her the dowry which she brought from her father's house, and she may go. This gave the woman agency in a desperate situation. She could choose to accept her husband's care, or she could choose to leave with her own financial resources intact, allowing her to return to her birth family with her independence. This set of laws governing illness in a marriage reveals the core principles of the code. It is not about emotion, but about contract and fairness. The marriage contract was not nullified by illness. The wife's dowry was her property, and her right to it was protected. The system sought to find a practical balance that upheld the duties of everyone involved, providing a social safety net, however rudimentary, for a woman who could no longer fulfill her expected role. The obsession with property, contracts, and heirs naturally extended beyond marriage into the equally complex set of rules governing inheritance, especially in cases where a family line was in danger of dying out. The continuation of the family line was of paramount importance in Babylonian society. Heirs were needed not just to inherit property and wealth, but to perform the essential religious rituals for the family's ancestors after their death. A childless couple faced a social and spiritual crisis. To solve this, adoption was an extremely common and legally formalized practice. A couple could adopt a son, often from a family with too many children, who would then be granted all the legal rights and responsibilities of a biological child. He would care for his adoptive parents in their old age and become their sole heir. The adoption was a formal contract, recorded on a clay tablet, and was meant to be permanent and binding for life. The system was designed to create a bond as strong as blood. The adoptive parents would invest years of their life and resources into raising the adopted child, treating him as their own in every way. But what would happen if, after all this, the adopted son had a change of heart? What if he located his birth family and decided he wanted to reject his adoptive parents and return to the family he came from? This was seen as a profound betrayal, a unilateral breaking of the most sacred family contract. The law of Hammurabi addressed this specific scenario with a punishment that was, like so many others, both symbolic and brutally physical. Law 192 and 193 deal with the fallout of a disloyal adopted son. The laws distinguish between a son adopted by a court official and one adopted by a commoner, but the principle is the same. If an adopted son seeks out and returns to his biological father's house, rejecting his adoptive family, he is not merely disinherited. The punishment is far more severe. He is to have his tongue cut out if he is the son of a courtier, or, as stated in another law regarding craftsmen who adopt, his eye is to be put out. The punishment was designed to fit the crime. He used his words to deny his parents, so he would lose his tongue. He used his eyes to look for his old family, so he would lose an eye. It was a permanent mark of his ingratitude. This severe punishment highlights the absolute sanctity of the adoption contract. In the eyes of the law, once you were adopted, that was your true family. To deny them was as bad as a biological son striking his father. It was an attack on the social order. The law ensured that people who adopted children could be confident that their chosen heir would not and could not abandon them without facing a horrific penalty. It made the bond of adoption legally unbreakable. But the law also protected the adopted child from fickle parents. If a man adopted a child and then had biological children of his own, he could not simply disinherit his adopted son. The adopted son was still entitled to a legally prescribed share of the inheritance. Let's consider another inheritance problem. What if a man dies, leaving behind a wife and young children? The wife, now a widow, is in a vulnerable position. The law sought to protect her and her children's inheritance. Law 171 states that she is entitled to her dowry and any gift her husband formally gave her in a written contract. She has the right to live in her husband's house for the rest of her life. However, she is not the outright owner of his property. She is its caretaker. The property legally belongs to her sons. She cannot sell it. because it is their future inheritance. This ensured that the family wealth would pass down the male line while still providing for the widow's security during her lifetime. The situation became more complicated if the widow decided to remarry. She was free to leave her deceased husband's home and start a new life, but she could not take her first husband's property with her. Law 172 is very clear on this. Before she remarries, the judges must investigate the estate of her first husband. The property is then entrusted to her and her new husband. They become the legal guardians of the estate, tasked with managing it and raising the little ones. They are essentially stewards of the children's inheritance. Crucially, the law adds, they may not sell the property. The children's financial future was protected by the court, preventing a new stepfather from squandering their birthright. These inheritance laws reveal a society obsessed with order, lineage, and the preservation of property across generations. The rules were designed to anticipate and prevent the most common sources of family conflict. They protected widows from being cast out, but also prevented them from controlling family wealth. They protected the inheritance of young children from potentially greedy new stepfathers. And they used brutal physical punishments to enforce the permanence of contracts like adoption. The family was a legal and economic institution, and the code provided a detailed, if harsh, instruction manual for how it was meant to function from one generation to the next, especially when it came to the ownership of the most valuable asset of all, land. Agriculture was the backbone of the Babylonian economy, and nearly all wealth was derived from the land. The laws governing fields, irrigation, and livestock were therefore some of the most detailed and important in the entire code. A farmer's life was governed by a web of regulations that dictated his responsibilities to his neighbors and the state. One of the most critical responsibilities was maintaining the complex network of irrigation canals that brought life-giving water from the Tigris and Euphrates rivers to the fields. A moment of negligence in this duty could have catastrophic consequences for the entire community, and the law held individuals ruthlessly accountable for any such failure. It was a system where a lazy farmer could easily ruin his neighbor. Let's put you in the sandals of a Babylonian farmer. Your plot of land is long and narrow, bordered on one side by a raised earthen dike, and beyond it, the community irrigation canal that is the lifeblood of your entire village. Each farmer whose land touches the canal is responsible for maintaining their specific section. It's a simple, vital duty. You must regularly inspect the dike, patch any cracks with fresh clay, and ensure it is strong enough to hold back the pressure of the water. Your neighbor to the south is diligent. His section of the dike is thick and well maintained. Your neighbor to the north is the same. The system only works if everyone does their part, a chain of mutual trust and responsibility, baked into the very landscape of your life. It is a social contract paid in mud and sweat. But you have grown lazy. Perhaps you were busy with other tasks, or maybe you just underestimated the strength of the river's current this season. You notice a small fissure in your section of the dike, a place where the water is seeping through, but you tell yourself you will fix it tomorrow. Tomorrow becomes the next day, and the next. You don't reinforce the wall properly. You pile on a bit of loose dirt, assuming it will be enough. It is a small act of negligence, a private shirking of your duty that you hope no one will notice. You are gambling, betting that your shoddy work will hold, that your laziness will have no consequences. But in the world of Hammurabi, the law was designed to punish exactly this kind of gamble, because your private laziness had very public consequences. One night, the pressure becomes too much. The weak spot in your dike gives way, not with a slow leak, but with a sudden, catastrophic breach. A torrent of muddy water bursts through the wall you failed to maintain. It doesn't just flood your own field. That would be a personal tragedy. Instead, the water pours sideways, cascading with destructive force directly into your neighbor's field. Your neighbor, the diligent one, the one who spent weeks tending his crop, is about to suffer because of your failure. His field of barley, golden and nearly ready for harvest, is completely submerged. The stalks are flattened, the grain ruined, an entire season of backbreaking labor wiped out in a single night because you decided to put off your repairs. The next morning, the devastation is clear. Your neighbor stands at the edge of his ruined field, a sea of mud where his family's food and income once stood. There is no question about who is to blame. The breach is on your land, a gaping wound in the dike that is a clear testament to your negligence. He doesn't need to argue with you or fight you. He simply takes his complaint to the city elders. The judges don't need a lengthy investigation. They invoke Law Number 55 of the Code, which was written for this exact situation. It is a law that doesn't care about your excuses or your intentions. It cares only about the ruined grain and the principle of restoring the economic balance you have so carelessly destroyed. Law 55 states that if a man is lazy in maintaining his dike and it breaks, causing the flooding of his neighbor's field, he must repay the neighbor for the grain he has caused to be lost. This is not a small fine. You are legally required to calculate the full value of the harvest your neighbor would have had and repay him, bushel for bushel. It is a devastating financial blow, likely wiping out your own profits for the year and then some. You have not only lost your own potential harvest, but now you owe your neighbor his as well. The law makes you directly responsible for the economic consequences of your inaction, turning your laziness into a massive personal debt. But the true terror of the law came in the next line. What if you cannot pay? What if, like many farmers, you don't have a surplus of silver or grain stored away to cover such a disaster? The code had a brutal answer for this. The law continues, stating that if the negligent farmer cannot repay the grain, he and his property shall be sold for silver, and the farmers whose grain was ruined shall share the money. Think about this. Your failure to patch a wall of mud means you lose everything. Your land, your tools, your livestock, and even your own personal freedom and that of your family are all forfeit. You would be sold into debt slavery, and the money raised from your sale would be used to compensate the neighbor you wronged. It was the ultimate motivator: do your duty, or risk losing not just your farm but your very liberty. This principle of debt and consequence was a central theme throughout the entire code. Life in Babylon ran on credit. Merchants needed loans to fund their caravans, and farmers needed loans of seed to get through a tough season. These transactions were all meticulously recorded on clay tablets, with interest rates and repayment terms clearly defined. The system was sophisticated, but the consequences for failure could be life-altering. However, the law also showed a surprising understanding of risk, distinguishing between a failure caused by bad luck and one caused by personal irresponsibility. It recognized that sometimes terrible things just happen, and a debtor should not always be the one to bear the full cost of a disaster they could not control. Let's imagine you are a merchant, borrowing a significant sum of silver from a wealthy investor to fund a trading mission to a distant city. The contract is sealed, stating you will repay the principal plus the standard 20% interest upon your return. You hire guards, load your donkeys with valuable textiles, and set off. But deep in the wilderness, your caravan is ambushed by a large band of robbers. Your guards are overwhelmed, your goods are stolen, and you barely escape with your life. You return to Babylon with nothing but the clothes on your back. You have lost everything, including the investor's silver. Under a simple interpretation of the contract, you would be ruined, facing a lifetime of debt you could never repay. But this is where the code's surprising sophistication comes in. You would go before a judge and invoke what we might call an act of God clause. Several laws dealt with unavoidable disasters. If a storm destroyed a farmer's crop, the law stated that his creditor could not demand interest for that year. In your case, as the merchant, the law was even more forgiving. You would be required to go to a temple and swear a solemn oath before the gods, detailing the circumstances of the robbery. If you made this oath, you were completely cleared of the debt. The law recognized that the loss was due to an external, violent force beyond your control. The risk, in this case, was legally assigned to the investor, not the borrower. This prevented a single unlucky event from plunging an honest merchant into a spiral of inescapable debt. This legal protection, however, was a shield against acts of fate, not a pardon for personal failure. If your business venture simply failed because you made bad deals, or if you squandered the money, you were still fully on the hook for the debt. And if you couldn't pay, the consequences were severe. This is where the institution of debt slavery came into play. A creditor could not simply throw you in a jail. Prisons as we know them were not a feature of Babylonian justice. Instead, the creditor had the right to seize human collateral. He could take you, your wife, your son, or your daughter to work in his household as debt slaves until the value of their labor had paid off what you owed. This practice, while harsh, was a fundamental part of the economy. It provided a last resort mechanism for creditors to recoup their losses. But even here, Hammurabi's code was not a free-for-all. It placed a crucial limit on this form of servitude, a legal protection that offered a glimmer of hope to the indebted. Law 117 is one of the most famous and humane in the entire code. It decreed that a person seized for a debt could only be held in servitude for a maximum of 3 years. In the 4th year, their freedom was to be restored. This was not a suggestion, it was the law. A creditor could not legally hold a family in bondage forever over a single unpaid loan. This 3-year limit was a brilliant piece of social engineering. It ensured that debt slavery was a temporary condition, not a permanent one. It acted as a societal pressure release valve, preventing the creation of a massive, permanent underclass of people enslaved by debt. It meant that a family could suffer a terrible financial setback, lose their freedom for a time, but ultimately have a chance to rebuild their lives. It gave people a light at the inky blackness of the tunnel of debt. This law stood in stark contrast to the systems in many other ancient societies, where debt could easily lead to lifelong, hereditary slavery. In Babylon, the slate could, after 3 years of hard labor, be wiped clean. The entire legal system, from business contracts to criminal law, depended on a single, fragile foundation: the truthfulness of human testimony. In an age before fingerprinting, DNA evidence, or forensic science, a legal case was built almost entirely on the words of witnesses and the oaths of the accused. The stability of the entire society rested on the belief that when people spoke before a judge, they were telling the truth. Because of this, the Code of Hammurabi treated the act of bearing false witness, of lying in court, as one of the most dangerous and corrosive crimes a person could commit. The punishments were designed to be so severe that they would terrify anyone who considered using the court system to settle a personal grudge. Imagine a bitter rivalry between you and another man in your city. He is more successful than you, and you resent him for it. You decide to use the law as a weapon. You go before the judges and accuse him of a capital crime, like murder or treason. You invent a story describing how you saw him commit the act. You have no proof, no other witnesses, just your own fabricated testimony. You are gambling that your word will be enough to condemn him, to remove him from your life forever. In doing so, you are not just attacking your rival, you are attacking the very integrity of the justice system itself. And the code was designed to defend itself against this kind of attack with absolute ferocity. The principle is laid out in the very first laws of the code, showing its fundamental importance. Law number 3 is clear and chilling. If a man has come forward in a case to bear false witness and has not proved the word that he has spoken, if that case is a case of life, that man shall be put to death. The logic is perfectly symmetrical. By giving false testimony in a murder trial, you were attempting to use the court to legally execute an innocent person. Therefore, in the eyes of the law, you were the one committing a form of murder. The penalty you were trying to inflict on another person was turned back upon you. Your lie was not just a lie, it was a weapon, and the law punished you as if you had successfully used it. This principle of reciprocity extended to all forms of litigation. It wasn't just about life and death cases. Law number 4 addresses false testimony in civil cases. For example, a lawsuit over a quantity of grain or silver. It states that if you testify falsely in such a case, you, quote, shall bear the penalty of that case. This meant that the entire financial risk of the lawsuit was transferred from the person you accused to you, the false witness. If your lie could have cost the defendant 10 shekels of silver, you would now have to pay 10 shekels of silver yourself. This made being a witness a role with immense personal risk. Before you stepped forward to testify, you had to be absolutely certain of your facts, because any disproven statement could have devastating consequences for you personally. This system placed an incredible burden on both judges and witnesses. Judges had to be skilled interrogators, adept at spotting inconsistencies in stories and weighing the credibility of different speakers. And witnesses had to be brave enough to speak the truth, but cautious enough not to embellish or speculate, for fear that any unprovable part of their testimony could be turned against them. It created a legal environment of extreme high stakes, where words had the power to save or condemn, not just the accused, but the speaker as well. The code's obsession with fairness and balance was never more apparent than in its treatment of those who would try to corrupt the process of justice from within. This passion for fairness extended even to the most humble of economic transactions. Let's return to our taverness, the woman running the local beer hall. We've seen how the law turned her into an unwilling informant for the state, responsible for reporting seditious talk. But the code also reached deep into her business practices, regulating her prices and her ethics with the same level of scrutiny. The state understood that beer was not a luxury. It was a staple of the Babylonian diet, a source of calories and nutrition for the common person. Therefore, ensuring that beer was sold fairly was a matter of public welfare. The government saw it as its duty to protect its citizens from being cheated by unscrupulous merchants, and it did so with laws that carried a shockingly severe penalty for a seemingly minor offense. Imagine a poor farmer coming into the city after selling his meager harvest. He has a sack of barley, the standard currency for many everyday transactions. He goes to a tavern to get a drink and a bit of food. He wants to pay with his grain, but the taverness refuses. "I only take silver," she says, knowing that the farmer likely has none. Or perhaps she does accept his grain, but she uses a rigged measure, giving him a volume of beer that is worth far less than the grain she took in payment. This is a classic form of price gouging, exploiting the poor and powerless. To us, it might seem like a matter for a consumer protection agency or a bad online review. In Babylon, it was a crime so serious it was punishable by death. Law 108 is shockingly direct. It addresses the taverness, who does not accept grain as the price of beer, but demands silver, or who makes the price of the beer less than the value of the grain. For this act of cheating her customers, the law prescribes only one punishment. They shall convict that tavern keeper and throw her into the water. The penalty for pouring a short measure or overcharging for a drink was execution by drowning. This seems wildly disproportionate to us, but it reveals the Babylonian state's priorities. The economic stability of the kingdom depended on fair trade in basic commodities. Cheating a farmer out of his grain was not just a private transaction, it was an act of destabilization, an attack on the economic well-being of the king's subjects, and it was punished with the full, terrifying force of the law. This intense legal scrutiny was applied to anyone in a position of public trust or responsibility. The state expected its citizens not just to obey the law, but to actively participate in its enforcement. This principle was starkly illustrated in the laws concerning one of the most fundamental and brutal aspects of Babylonian society: slavery. Slaves were a common sight in any Babylonian city. They were typically prisoners of war or people who had been sold into slavery for debt or other crimes. Legally, they were considered property, valuable assets belonging to their masters. A runaway slave was therefore not a person seeking freedom, but a piece of stolen property that needed to be recovered, and the law demanded that every citizen assist in that recovery. Imagine you live a quiet life as a craftsman in a small village. You are not a slave owner and have no desire to be involved in the institution. One evening, you are walking near the edge of town when you find a man hiding in a reed thicket. He is exhausted, scared, and bears the markings of a slave. He tells you he has escaped from a brutal master in a nearby city and begs you for help, a piece of bread, a place to hide for the night, anything. Your immediate human reaction might be one of sympathy. You see a fellow human being in desperate need. You might be tempted to help him, or at the very least, to look the other way and let him continue his flight to freedom. But under the code of Hammurabi, that compassionate impulse could cost you your life. The law did not permit you to be a neutral bystander. It forced you to make a choice, and it made the moral choice the illegal one. Law 16 is explicit. If a man has harbored in his house a fugitive male or female slave from the palace or from a commoner, and has not brought him forth at the summons of the herald, the owner of that house shall be put to death. Your home, your private sanctuary, was not exempt from this law. To give a runaway slave food or shelter, to simply fail to report their presence, was a capital offense. The state considered harboring a slave to be an act of theft against the owner and an act of rebellion against the social order. The law transformed every citizen into a potential slave catcher. It created a society where a person fleeing bondage could trust no one. The man hiding in the reeds would look at you not just with hope, but with fear, knowing that the law incentivized you to betray him. The only legal and safe course of action for you was to seize the slave and return him to his owner. Law 17 even specified the reward for doing so, 2 shekels of silver. The state was willing to pay a small finder's fee for the return of valuable property, but the penalty for compassion was absolute. This set of laws was designed to make escape from slavery nearly impossible, weaving the enforcement of the institution into the very fabric of civic duty. The code's intricate rules governed not only humans, but also the animals that were so essential to the Babylonian economy. Livestock, particularly oxen, were the tractors and beasts of burden of the ancient world. An ox was a hugely valuable asset, and losing one could be financially crippling for a farmer. Because of this, the law provided detailed regulations for people who rented or borrowed animals, creating a system of liability that was, once again, surprisingly nuanced. The law made a careful distinction between an animal that died through negligence, an act of God, or a pre-existing condition, assigning responsibility in a way that it deemed to be fair and balanced for all parties involved in the transaction. Let's say you are a farmer whose own ox has died and you need to plow your field. You go to your wealthier neighbor and rent one of his oxen for a few weeks. The rental agreement, likely a verbal contract made before witnesses, is simple. You will pay a set amount of grain for the use of the animal and are expected to return it in good health. While the ox is in your care, you are its temporary master, responsible for its well-being. But this responsibility had its limits. The law did not expect you to be a veterinarian or a miracle worker. It judged you based on what a reasonable person could foresee and control. While you are working the ox in your field, it suddenly collapses and dies. There was no warning. It simply falls to the ground. You are now in a terrible position. You have a dead ox on your hands that belongs to another man. He will surely demand compensation. When you go before the judges, the key question will be, why did the ox die? If the owner accuses you of negligence, of overworking or starving the animal, you would be in serious trouble. If found guilty, you would have to replace the ox with another of equal value. But the law provided you with a powerful defense, the oath. You could go before the gods and swear that you were not at fault, that you had cared for the animal properly. Law 249 specifically covers this scenario. It says that if a man rents an ox and it dies by the act of a god, or from a natural cause, the man who rented it shall swear by the name of a god and shall go free. This is another example of the law protecting people from blame for events beyond their control. A sudden illness or a lightning strike was not the renter's fault, and the financial loss was to be borne by the ox's owner. However, the law had no patience for violence or abuse. Law 245 states that if the rented ox dies as a result of beating or neglect, the renter must replace it. The difference between financial ruin and freedom rested entirely on the credibility of your oath. The code even delved into the specifics of veterinary malpractice. What if you rented the ox and it fell ill, and you hired an ox doctor to treat it? These early veterinarians performed surgeries and administered treatments, but their work, like that of human doctors, carried immense risk. Law 224 addresses a major surgery. If the ox doctor makes a severe wound and saves the animal's life, the owner pays him a fee. But Law 225 gives the flip side. If he makes a severe wound and the ox dies, he must pay the owner 1/4 of the ox's value. The penalty for failure was not as severe as for human doctors. No cutting off of hands here, but it still held the veterinarian financially accountable for the outcome of his work. The most bizarre law concerning rented oxen, however, was about attacks from wild animals. Imagine you have rented an ox and are taking it through a pasture when a lion leaps from the reeds and kills it. This is a terrifying event, but legally, who is responsible for the loss? Common sense might suggest it's another, quote, act of God, and the renter should be blameless. But the Babylonians were intensely practical people. Law 244 states, "If a god has struck it and it has died, the man who rented the ox shall swear by God and go free. But if it dies by the stroke of a lion, the loss is to its owner." The text seems to place the lion attack in a special category, a risk borne by the owner. It ensured that a renter wouldn't be ruined just because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. These laws about animals demonstrate the code's overarching obsession with assigning responsibility in a complex world. Every possible negative outcome, from a broken dike to a dead ox, was analyzed, and a specific rule of liability was created for it. The goal was always to restore economic balance and prevent disputes from escalating into violent feuds. The system relied heavily on oaths, contracts, and the testimony of witnesses, but it also relied on the wisdom and integrity of the people tasked with interpreting these complex laws, the judges themselves. The code recognized that a corrupt judge was a greater threat to the kingdom than any thief or negligent farmer. A judge in Babylon held immense power. He could decide who lived and who died, who was rich and who was destitute. His judgment was meant to be the final word, a reflection of the king's own justice. Because of this high standing, the temptation for bribery and corruption was enormous. A wealthy litigant might try to sway a decision in his favor with a gift of silver. The Code of Hammurabi understood this human weakness and sought to eradicate it with a punishment so severe and so humiliating that it would, in theory, make any judge think twice before accepting a bribe or knowingly rendering a false judgment. The law held its own enforcers to the highest and most brutal standard. Imagine a legal dispute over land ownership between a rich man and a poor man. The evidence is ambiguous, but the poor man's claim seems slightly stronger. However, the rich man secretly pays the judge a hefty bribe. The judge then issues a formal written decision, a judgment on a sealed clay tablet, siding with the rich man. The poor man has been cheated, not by the law, but by the man entrusted to apply it. For a time, it seems the judge and the rich man have gotten away with their crime. But what if new evidence comes to light, or the bribe is somehow exposed? The code had a specific and unforgiving process for dealing with a judge who had perverted the course of justice. Law number 5 is direct and ruthless. It says that if a judge renders a decision, and it is later proved that his judgment was in error, he must first pay 12 times the penalty of the lawsuit he judged. So if the case was worth 10 shekels of silver, the judge now owes a crushing 120 shekels. This financial punishment was designed to be ruinous, but that was only the beginning of his humiliation. The law continues, and then he shall be publicly removed from his seat of judgment and shall not return to sit with the judges in a case. He would be stripped of his office in a public ceremony, a total disgrace. He would lose his status, his power, and his career forever. This punishment was a powerful deterrent. It attacked the corrupt judge on every level. It destroyed him financially, it destroyed his professional life, and it destroyed his social standing. There was no path to redemption. One bad judgment, one proven act of corruption, meant a permanent fall from grace. This law was Hammurabi's way of ensuring that the people could have faith in his legal system. It was a promise that the judges who acted in his name were extensions of his own royal authority, and that any betrayal of that authority would be met with a punishment that was both financially and socially absolute. It was the system's ultimate self-defense mechanism. The Code of Hammurabi, in its entirety, presents a picture of a society that craved order above all else. It was a world of clearly defined roles, responsibilities, and consequences. Every person, from the king down to the humblest farmer, was slotted into a social hierarchy and given a detailed set of rules to live by. The laws were not a philosophical guide to moral behavior. They were a practical and often brutal instruction manual for how to maintain the stability of the state. They regulated every conceivable human interaction, from professional malpractice to family disputes, from agricultural negligence to the price of beer, ensuring that for every action there was a predictable and often terrifying reaction. The myth of an eye for an eye is a dramatic oversimplification of this complex reality. That principle of symmetrical retribution did exist, but it was almost exclusively reserved for crimes between social equals. As we have seen, the eye of a nobleman was worth a surgeon's hands, while the eye of a commoner was worth a bag of silver, and the eye of a slave was worth half his market price. Justice was not blind, it was obsessed with status. Your punishment was determined not just by what you did, but by who you were and who your victim was. It was a system designed to protect the existing social structure, reinforcing the power of the wealthy, the authority of fathers, and the property rights of slave owners. If you were to break a law under Hammurabi's code, your fate would hang on a complex set of variables. Were you rich or poor? Were you a man or a woman? Was your victim a nobleman or a slave? Did you have witnesses? Or would your fate be decided by the river god? Your life was a constant navigation of these high-stakes rules. As a builder, your son's life was collateral for the strength of your walls. As a doctor, your hands were collateral for the success of your surgery. As a tavern owner, your life was collateral for the political opinions of your customers. And as a poor man driven to steal a goat, your poverty itself was a death sentence. The code's genius was not in its cruelty, but in its specificity. It attempted to create a society where every dispute had a pre-written answer, removing the ambiguity and uncertainty that can lead to chaos. By carving these laws into a stone pillar and placing it in the center of the city, Hammurabi was making a powerful statement. The rules are known. They apply to everyone, albeit differently, and they are backed by the unquestionable authority of the king and the gods. It was a monumental effort to replace cycles of blood feuds and private vengeance with a centralized, state-sanctioned system of justice. The punishments were harsh, precisely so that people would fear the law more than they desired revenge. We look back at these laws from our modern perspective and see brutality, inequality, and superstition. We see a legal system that used mutilation as a common punishment, that executed people for property crimes, and that believed a river could determine guilt or innocence. It is easy to dismiss it as a primitive and barbaric relic of the distant past, but in its time, it was a revolutionary leap forward. It was one of the first comprehensive attempts to create a society governed by written laws, rather than the arbitrary whims of the powerful. It was a system that, for all its flaws, operated on a predictable, if ruthless, logic. Living under this code would have meant inhabiting a world of constant, low-level anxiety. Every professional decision, every family argument, every business transaction carried a weight we can barely imagine. The margin for error was razor-thin, and the consequences for failure were often permanent and devastating. It was a world that demanded diligence, obedience, and a healthy dose of fear. Your relationships with your neighbors were not just social. They were legal, governed by a web of duties and potential liabilities. Your relationship with your family was not just emotional. It was contractual, with your rights and status defined by your adherence to your prescribed role. The world of Hammurabi's Babylon was not a world of freedom as we would understand it. It was a world of interlocking obligations. You were obligated to maintain your dike, to report seditious talk, to return runaway slaves, and to honor your contracts. Your freedom was the freedom to operate within this rigid framework. The law did not exist to protect your individual rights. It existed to protect the stability and order of the collective. Your life, your body, and your property were all, in the end, assets of the state, to be managed and, if necessary, sacrificed for the greater good of the kingdom. The code also reveals a deep psychological insight into human nature. It understood that people are motivated by self-interest, tempted by greed, and prone to laziness. The laws were designed to counteract these impulses with consequences that were immediate, tangible, and terrifying. The body of the thief walled into the house he broke into, the hands of the failed surgeon cut off, the false witness put to death. These were not just punishments, they were powerful public statements, pieces of political theater designed to etch the law into the collective consciousness of the people. Justice was not just done, it was seen to be done, in the most visceral way possible. While the code regulated public life with an iron grip, it also left vast areas of human experience untouched. It has little to say about love, friendship, or personal belief, except where those things intersected with a contract or a crime. It was a legal document, not a moral one. It was concerned with what you did, not with what you thought or felt. This is why it can seem so cold and impersonal to us. It is the operating system for a society, a set of commands designed to keep the machine of the state running smoothly, with little regard for the happiness of the individual components within it. The code's influence was immense. It served as a model for legal systems throughout the ancient Near East for centuries. Elements of its logic, the importance of written contracts, the principle of retribution, the protection of property, can be seen echoed in later legal traditions. It represents a pivotal moment in human history, the point at which a society consciously decided to define itself through a comprehensive, written system of laws. It was an ambitious and ultimately successful attempt to build a civilization that could outlast a single monarch, a kingdom built not just on walls of mud brick, but on pillars of stone-carved law. So, if you broke a law in Hammurabi's time, your experience would be a stark lesson in the realities of ancient justice. You would find that mercy was in short supply, that your social status was your most important defense, and that the law was more concerned with restoring a shattered economic balance than with understanding your personal motivations. You might find your fate decided by the testimony of a rival, the integrity of a judge, or the currents of the sacred river. Your punishment would be swift, public, and often designed to be a permanent, physical reminder of your transgression. You would learn, in the most personal way possible, that in the world of Hammurabi, order was everything. This relentless pursuit of order extended to every corner of society. There were few, if any, legal loopholes. The code attempted to be comprehensive, to provide an answer for every conceivable dispute. For example, it even had laws about building and naval contracts. If a shipbuilder built a boat for a man, he had to guarantee its seaworthiness for 1 year. If the boat revealed a defect within that year and had to be repaired, the shipbuilder had to strengthen it at his own expense. This is one of the world's first recorded consumer warranties, a legal protection designed to ensure quality workmanship in a vital industry. The same practical logic that governed houses and canals also governed the boats that plied the great rivers. This practicality is perhaps the code's most defining feature. It is a document written by a king who was also a master administrator. Hammurabi was not just a conqueror, he was a builder, a manager, and an engineer of society. His laws reflect a mind obsessed with function, efficiency, and stability. Why was the penalty for overcharging for beer death by drowning? Because a stable food supply at a fair price was essential to preventing civil unrest. Why was harboring a slave a capital crime? Because the slave-based economy was a crucial pillar of the state's power. Every law, no matter how strange or brutal it seems to us, had a clear, practical purpose within the context of its time. We see this logic again in the laws of military service. A soldier's duty was absolute. If a soldier was ordered to go on a royal campaign and refused, or if he hired a substitute to go in his place, that soldier was to be put to death. There was no room for disobedience in the king's army. But the code also protected the soldier's family and property while he was away. Law 30 stated that if a soldier was taken captive while in the king's service, his field and garden would be given to another to cultivate, but if the soldier's son was able to take on the duty, the property would be given to him. The law ensured that the soldier's land would remain productive and in the family if possible. Furthermore, the code even provided for the soldier's rescue. If a captured soldier was brought back to his home city, his ransom was a community responsibility. If he had the means to ransom himself, he had to do so. If not, the law dictated that his local temple should pay for his freedom. And if the temple did not have the funds, the state itself, the palace, would pay his ransom. The law made a promise to its soldiers: if you serve the king and are captured, we will not abandon you. This was a powerful tool for building loyalty and morale within the army. It showed that the interlocking system of obligations went both ways. The citizen had a duty to the state, but the state also had a duty to its citizens, especially those who fought in its name. This principle of state-backed security, this promise that the kingdom would not abandon its loyal servants, was a cornerstone of Hammurabi's rule. The law was a covenant between the ruler and the ruled, a set of mutual obligations designed to create a stable and predictable society. But this covenant did not just cover the actions of people, it extended to the behavior of the animals they owned. The code recognized that a dangerous animal was a public menace, a threat to the community's safety. The law had to decide: when an animal causes harm, who is truly to blame? Is it a tragic accident, a freak of nature, or is it the result of human negligence? The answer, as always in Babylon, depended on what the owner knew and when they knew it. Let us conjure a scene from a dusty Babylonian street. A man owns a large, powerful ox, which he uses to plow his fields. He knows this particular animal has a foul temper. It has a history of aggression, of charging at people and trying to gore them with its horns. The local authorities, the ward council, have formally warned him about his ox. They have told him, "Your ox is a known gorer. You must keep it properly confined, or you will be held responsible for its actions." The owner hears their warning, but perhaps he is lazy, or perhaps he doesn't take it seriously. He keeps the ox in a pen with a weak fence, assuming it will be enough to hold the beast. It is a fatal miscalculation. One afternoon, the ox, in a fit of rage, easily breaks through the flimsy fence and rampages down the village street. A nobleman, and a whilom of high status, is walking home from the temple. He has no time to react. The ox charges, its massive head lowered, and it gores the man, killing him instantly. The community is thrown into chaos and grief. The owner of the ox is quickly identified and brought before the judges. This is not a simple case of an animal accident. This is a case of deadly negligence, and the law for this situation Law 251, is specific and severe. The owner had been warned, he knew the risks, and did nothing. He failed in his duty to protect his community from the danger he possessed. The judges do not see this as a simple property dispute. They see it as a case of manslaughter by negligence. Because the owner was formally warned and failed to blunt its horns or tie it up, the law holds him directly responsible for the nobleman's death. The punishment is not a fine to be paid in silver or grain, it is a punishment of perfect, brutal symmetry. The law states that the negligent owner must pay a penalty of 1/2 mina of silver, a very large sum. And in cases of extreme repeated negligence leading to death, some interpretations suggest the consequences could have been even more severe, approaching a life-for-a-life scenario, holding the owner as culpable as a murderer. His failure to control his property resulted in the loss of a human life, and he would pay a price that reflected the gravity of that failure. But now let us rewind the story and change one crucial fact. The ox is still ill-tempered, it still breaks free from its pen, and it still kills a man on the street. However, in this version, the ox had no prior history of violence. It had always been a docile, placid animal. The owner had no reason to believe it was dangerous. The attack was a sudden, unpredictable event. The law of Hammurabi made a critical distinction for this scenario. Law 250 states that if an ox gores a man while it is going along the street, and its owner was not aware of its vicious nature, then that case has no penalty. It was considered a tragic accident, an act of the gods, and the owner was not held legally responsible for the death. This distinction between prior knowledge and a freak accident is a remarkably modern legal concept. It is the idea of foreseeability. Could the owner have reasonably predicted and prevented the harm? The Babylonian legal system understood this fundamental difference. It did not punish people for pure misfortune. It punished them for negligence, for failing to act on knowledge that they possessed. The entire legal case would hinge on the testimony of the ward council. Did they, or did they not, warn the owner about his ox? The presence or absence of that single formal warning was the difference between walking away a free man and facing financial ruin, or worse, for the death of his neighbor. And, as we have come to expect from the code, the penalty was also adjusted based on the victim's social status. Let's return to our negligent owner, the one who was warned about his dangerous ox. The animal breaks free and kills someone, but this time the victim is not a nobleman. He is a slave, the property of another man. The physical act is the same. A man is dead. The owner's negligence is the same. He failed to secure his dangerous animal. But the legal consequence, as prescribed by Law 252, is vastly different. The owner is not held responsible for a human life in the same way. Instead, he is held responsible for the destruction of property. The law requires him to pay 1/3 of a mina of silver to the slave's master. Once again, the law functions as a price list for human life. The death of a high-status freeman was a grave offense against the community, with a severe penalty. The death of a slave was a financial inconvenience for his owner, to be settled with a payment of silver. The slave himself is not the victim in the eyes of the law. His owner is. The punishment is not designed to reflect the tragedy of a life lost, but to compensate the master for his economic damages. This principle ran through every law of the code, a constant reminder that in Babylon, justice was not a universal concept but a privilege of rank. This obsession with property and responsibility was just as intense when it came to the shepherds who managed the kingdom's vast flocks. Shepherds were the custodians of a huge portion of the nation's wealth. A flock of sheep or goats represented a massive investment, providing wool, milk, and meat. A good shepherd was a skilled professional, entrusted with the health and safety of hundreds of animals. But a bad shepherd could be a disaster. The Code of Hammurabi contained a series of laws designed to hold these men accountable, ensuring that they could not get away with negligence, incompetence, or outright fraud. A shepherd's contract was a serious legal agreement, and any failure on his part would be judged with the same cold, economic logic applied to builders, doctors, and ox owners. He was in essence the manager of a mobile living asset. Imagine you are a wealthy landowner who has entrusted a flock of 100 sheep to a shepherd. The agreement is clear. He will take the flock to good pasture, protect them from predators, and at the end of the season, he will return the flock along with a share of the new lambs. But this shepherd is careless. He lets the sheep drink from a stagnant pool, and a disease sweeps through the flock. Or perhaps he falls asleep on the job, and a lion attacks, carrying off several ewes. When the time comes to return the flock, he comes back with only 80 sheep, claiming the losses were due to disease and predators. How does the law determine if he is telling the truth? The code placed the burden of proof squarely on the shepherd. Law 266 states that if a, quote, stroke of God, like a disease, or a lion causes a loss in the fold, the shepherd shall clear himself before the God by swearing an oath. If he makes this oath, the owner of the flock has to accept the loss. This is the familiar act of God defense we have seen before. However, the law was wise to the possibility of a shepherd's own carelessness. Law 267 is the crucial counterpoint. If the shepherd has been negligent, he shall make good the loss in cattle or sheep which he has caused, and pay it to their owner. The shepherd could not simply blame a lion for a loss that was really his fault for not being vigilant. The most common form of negligence was a disease called scab, which was well known in ancient times. The code had a specific law just for this. If a shepherd was so incompetent that he allowed scab to break out in the flock, he was held fully financially responsible. He had to bear the cost of the lost animals, repaying the owner from his own property. But the code also went after deliberate fraud. A dishonest shepherd might try to sell some of the owner's sheep for his own profit, or he might alter the number of new lambs, keeping the best ones for himself. This was not just negligence, it was theft. Law 265 states that if a shepherd is caught in this kind of fraud, he must pay back tenfold what he has stolen. This tenfold penalty was the standard punishment for stealing from a commoner. It shows that the law viewed the shepherd's fraud as a serious breach of trust, equivalent to outright theft. He had been given custody of the owner's property, and he had used that position to enrich himself. The punishment was designed to be financially ruinous, a clear message to all shepherds that the risks of dishonesty far outweighed any potential reward. The entire system of pastoralism, so vital to the economy, depended on the owner's ability to trust the shepherd, and the law enforced that trust with the threat of overwhelming debt for any who dared to betray it. This level of contractual detail extended from the fields into the most intimate corners of the Babylonian home. In an era of high infant mortality, the health and survival of a newborn child was a family's paramount concern. If a mother was unable to nurse her child herself, either due to illness, death, or the need to return to work, families would hire a professional wet nurse. This was a common and vital service. The wet nurse would take the infant into her own home, nursing and caring for him for a period of 2 to 3 years. This was a formal, contractual arrangement, and like all contracts in Babylon, it was governed by a strict set of laws designed to protect the interests of the child's parents and ensure the wet nurse fulfilled her duties with the utmost diligence. Imagine a young couple whose firstborn son needs a wet nurse. They find a woman in their village and draw up a contract. The agreement, recorded on a small clay tablet, would specify the payment, a certain amount of grain, oil, and wool per year. The wet nurse takes the baby, and for a time, everything seems fine. The parents trust that their child is being properly cared for. But the law of Hammurabi was built on a foundation of suspicion. It anticipated the ways this arrangement could go horribly wrong. It foresaw the possibility of a lazy or even malicious wet nurse, and it prescribed a punishment that was both uniquely symbolic and utterly terrifying. The greatest fear for the parents was that the infant would die while in the wet nurse's care. What if the baby died not from a natural illness, but from the nurse's negligence? Law 194 addresses this. It says that if the child dies in her arms, and it is proven that she had been substituting another child to nurse without the parents' knowledge, perhaps because her own milk had run dry and she wanted to keep collecting her fee, then she was guilty of a profound fraud. The punishment for this was not a fine. For the crime of letting a contracted child die while she nursed another, the law states, "They shall cut off her breasts." It was a mutilation that directly mirrored her crime, a permanent, public mark of her failure in her most essential duty. This brutal punishment served as a powerful guarantee to parents. It ensured that a wet nurse would be incredibly motivated to keep her charge alive and healthy. The physical threat was a constant reminder of her contractual obligation. The law was not interested in her excuses. It was interested in the outcome. The survival of the child was her sole responsibility, and any failure, particularly one involving deception, would be met with a punishment that destroyed her ability to ever work as a wet nurse again. It was the ultimate enforcement of a professional standard. This principle of physical, symmetrical punishment was a hallmark of the code, and it appeared most frequently in the laws governing assault and personal injury. We have seen that a son who struck his father would have his hand cut off. This was a special case, a crime against the social hierarchy. But what about violence between equals or between people of different social classes? The common myth of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, comes directly from this section of the code. But this famous phrase is deeply misleading, because the principle of a life for a life or a limb for a limb only applied in one very specific context: when a nobleman assaulted another nobleman. It was a law that protected the bodies of the elite from each other, but it offered no such protection to those lower down the social ladder. Let's stage a simple street fight in Babylon. Two noblemen, two Awilam, get into a heated argument over a business deal. The argument escalates, and one man punches the other in the face, knocking out one of his teeth. The injured man takes his case to the judges. They consult law number 200, which states, "If a man has knocked out the tooth of a man who is his equal, his tooth shall be knocked out." The punishment is a perfect mirror of the crime. The court would order a guard to strike the aggressor in the same way, inflicting the exact same injury he had caused. It was a visceral, personal form of justice, designed to create a powerful deterrent among the ruling class. Now, let's change the identities of the people involved. The aggressor is still a nobleman, a man of wealth and power, but the man he punches is a mushkenim, a commoner, a free man of lower status. The crime is identical. A tooth has been knocked out. The pain and injury are identical, but the legal consequence is completely different. The judge now turns to law number 201, which reads, "If he has knocked out the tooth of a commoner, he shall pay 1/3 of a mina of silver." The nobleman does not lose his own tooth. His physical body is considered untouchable by the law in this context. He simply pays a fine. His wealth allows him to injure his social inferiors with relative impunity. The contrast is stark and intentional. The body of a nobleman was sacred, and any harm done to it by a peer had to be repaid in kind. The body of a commoner, however, had a price tag. The law did not see the two men as equal victims. It saw one as a member of the protected class and the other as a lesser citizen whose suffering could be compensated with money. This class-based system of justice was the fundamental operating principle of the entire code. The law existed to maintain the existing power structure, and it did so by explicitly valuing the lives and bodies of the elite more than anyone else. This principle became even more pronounced when the victim was at the very bottom of the social hierarchy. Let's run our scenario one final time. A man, it doesn't matter if he is a nobleman or a commoner, gets angry and strikes a slave, knocking out the slave's tooth. The slave belongs to another man. The judge now refers to Law 205. The punishment is not physical, and the fine is even smaller. The law states that the aggressor shall pay 1/2 of his value in silver to the slave's master. Once again, the slave is not the victim. His owner is. The penalty is for damaging another person's property. The slave's tooth is valued as a fraction of his total market price, like a dent in a chariot or a chip in a pot. The slave's pain and injury are legally irrelevant. These three laws, for the very same physical act, paint a perfect picture of the Babylonian social pyramid. At the top are the Owilim, the noblemen, whose bodies were protected by the principle of equal retribution. In the middle were the Mushkenim, the commoners, whose bodies could be harmed for a price. And at the bottom were the slaves, whose bodies were mere property, with their value determined by the market. This tiered system of justice is the single most important reality of the Code of Hammurabi. The popular idea of an eye for an eye was not a universal principle of justice. It was a class privilege, a luxury afforded only to the men at the very top of the social hierarchy. This obsession with social status permeated even the most seemingly neutral of laws. Consider the crime of abduction. Kidnapping a person is a serious offense in any society. In Babylon, the penalty for it was, unsurprisingly, death. But the law was not concerned with the traumatic experience of the victim. It was concerned with the social and economic category of the person who had been stolen. Law 14 is simple and direct. If a man has stolen the young son of another man, he shall be put to death. The crime here is stealing a freeman, a potential heir and a member of the community. It was an attack on the integrity of a family, and the punishment was absolute. But what about other forms of kidnapping? The code was silent on the abduction of a slave by a freeman because that was simply considered theft of property, covered by other laws. The real focus was on maintaining the clear lines between the social classes. The law was particularly concerned with Babylonian citizens being sold into slavery abroad. If a merchant or slave trader kidnapped a Babylonian and sold them in a foreign land, they were disrupting the social order of the kingdom. This was seen as a betrayal of their community, and the penalty for it was death. The law protected its own citizens from being turned into commodities for foreign markets, preserving the pool of freemen who formed the backbone of the state. The code also reveals a society that was deeply concerned with reputation and public decency, especially when it came to women and religious figures. Slander was a serious matter. We saw how a false accusation of adultery could lead to the accuser's death if the river ordeal proved him wrong. Another law, number 127, dealt with a more general form of public shaming. It concerned the act of pointing the finger at a high priestess or another man's wife without just cause. This act of public accusation, of starting a malicious rumor, was not taken lightly. If the accuser could not prove his claim, he would be brought before the judges and marked, likely by being branded or shaved in a particular way, as a public sign of his status as a convicted slanderer. This law protected the honor of women, particularly those in roles that demanded a high degree of respect and chastity. A man could not simply destroy a woman's reputation with baseless gossip. He had to have proof, or he would bear a permanent physical mark of his crime. This shows that while women had fewer rights than men, the law did recognize that their social standing and honor had legal value and were worthy of protection from malicious attacks. It was another mechanism for maintaining social order, preventing the chaos that could erupt from uncontrolled personal vendettas and baseless rumors that could tear a community apart. This protective impulse even extended to the realm of commercial reputation. The Code of Hammurabi, for all its detail, could not possibly cover every single eventuality. There were bound to be gaps, situations that fell between the cracks of its meticulously crafted laws. What happened in a case where the evidence was truly impossible to obtain, where there were no witnesses and the crime was a secret act of theft? Once again, when human justice reached its limits, the Babylonians turned to the divine. The oath sworn before a god was the ultimate legal tool, a way to resolve disputes that were otherwise unresolvable. It was a formal declaration of truth, with the understanding that lying to the gods would invite a divine punishment far worse than anything a human judge could inflict. Imagine a man who entrusts some of his property, silver, gold, or other valuables to his neighbor for safekeeping while he goes on a long journey. This was a common practice, a bailment based on trust. The agreement is informal, just a verbal understanding between two people. When the man returns, the neighbor denies ever receiving the goods. Or perhaps he claims the house was burglarized and the items were stolen. There is no written contract and no witnesses. It is one man's word against another's. This is a perfect legal deadlock. How could a judge possibly determine the truth? The law provided a clear two-step process to solve this dilemma. First, according to Law 120, the owner of the lost goods had to formally list everything he had lost. Then, the neighbor who had taken the property for safekeeping had to go before a god and swear an oath that he was innocent. He had to declare that he did not steal the goods and that they were not lost through his negligence. If he was willing to take this solemn oath, the case was dismissed. The law presumed that no one would be reckless enough to lie directly to a god. However, if the neighbor had been careless, if the goods were stolen because he failed to properly secure his house, then he was found liable. He had to make good and replace all that was lost to its owner. The oath was the final backstop of the legal system, a mechanism of last resort for when human evidence failed. It appears again and again throughout the code, in cases of accidental death of livestock, in cases of disputed debts, and in cases where property was lost in a fire. It reveals a society that was so deeply religious that an appeal to the gods was considered a valid and binding form of evidence. The fear of divine retribution was a powerful tool of social control, a way to compel truthfulness when no human could. This reliance on the supernatural sat side by side with the code's otherwise brutally practical and worldly concerns, a fusion of the sacred and the profane that defined the Babylonian worldview. This worldview was, at its core, deeply pessimistic. It assumed that people were prone to cheating, lying, and violence. It assumed that without a rigid framework of rules and terrifying consequences, society would quickly descend into chaos. The code is not a document that expresses hope for the best in human nature. It is a document that prepares for the worst. It is a set of defensive walls built around the concepts of property, status, and authority. Every law is a buttress, every punishment a guard tower, all designed to protect the fragile structure of civilization from the destructive impulses of the individuals within it. It is a manual for survival, not a blueprint for utopia. We see this in the very way the laws are structured. They are almost all if-then statements. If a man does X, then Y shall be done to him. There is no discussion of morality, no exploration of intent beyond the most basic distinctions of negligence or accident. The law is a machine. A crime is an input, and a punishment is an output. The judges were not there to interpret the spirit of the law, but to execute its letter. This mechanical quality is what makes the code feel so alien and unyielding to us. It lacks the flexibility and the focus on rehabilitation that we expect from a modern legal system. Its purpose was not to improve the offender, but to rebalance the cosmic scales and terrify everyone else into obedience. This system, for all its harshness, provided one thing that was incredibly valuable in the ancient world: predictability. A farmer, a merchant, or a craftsman in Babylon knew where he stood. He knew his rights, his duties, and the exact consequences of his actions. A contract recorded on a clay tablet was a powerful tool, a guarantee that a deal was a deal. This legal certainty was the grease that allowed the gears of the complex Babylonian economy to turn. It allowed for long-distance trade, for credit and investment, and for the large-scale public works that defined the kingdom. The code's brutal enforcement was the price of this stability. It is also important to remember what is absent from the code. There are no laws about what we would call human rights. There is no concept of free speech, no right to privacy, no protection from the state. In fact, many of the laws were designed to do the opposite, to turn citizens into informants, and to give the state authority over even the most private matters. The individual existed to serve the state and the social order, not the other way around. The idea that a person has inherent rights that the government cannot take away would have been a completely foreign concept to the architects of this legal system. The only rights you had were those explicitly granted to you by the code, and those rights were always tied to your status and your willingness to fulfill your obligations. The code also gives us a glimpse into the daily life and the common problems of the people of Babylon. The sheer number of laws about agriculture, irrigation, and livestock shows us a society utterly dependent on the land. The detailed laws about contracts, loans, and interest rates reveal a bustling commercial economy. The laws about family, marriage, and inheritance paint a picture of a society where the household was the central economic and social unit. The code is not just a legal document. It is a rich, if sometimes horrifying, historical source that allows us to walk the streets of a city that vanished thousands of years ago. The legacy of Hammurabi's code is complex. It is not the direct ancestor of modern Western law, but its influence was felt for 1,000 years in the Near East. It established a powerful precedent that a king's greatest duty was to provide justice for his people, and that this justice should be based on a publicly known written code. This was a radical idea in a world often governed by the secret knowledge of priests or the unpredictable whims of kings. Hammurabi's decision to erect his stela in public was a profound act of political communication, a declaration that his rule was based on law, not just on force. When we imagine ourselves in that world, breaking one of these laws, we are forced to confront the vast distance between our own values and those of the past. Our modern legal systems are built on principles like universal rights, equality before the law, and the idea that punishment should be rehabilitative as well as punitive. The Code of Hammurabi rejects all of these ideas. It embraces inequality as a natural and necessary part of the social order. It sees punishment as a tool for retribution and deterrence. And it places the stability of the collective far, far above the rights or happiness of the individual. The true feeling of living under the code would not have been one of constant, dramatic terror, but of a pervasive background caution. It would be the caution of a farmer checking his dike one extra time, the caution of a surgeon before operating on a nobleman, the caution of a man choosing his words carefully in a tavern. It was a system that encouraged conformity and discouraged risk-taking. It rewarded those who followed the rules, maintained their property, and honored their contracts. And it ruthlessly crushed those who, through misfortune, negligence, or rebellion, stepped outside the clearly marked lines of acceptable behavior. This world of clay tablets and divine judgment seems impossibly remote, and yet the core problems the code tried to solve are timeless. How does a society protect property? How does it enforce contracts? How does it resolve disputes between its members? How does it balance the needs of the individual against the needs of the community? The solutions Hammurabi provided are not our solutions. They are often brutal and deeply unjust by our standards. But in their attempt to answer these fundamental questions, to impose a human-made order on a chaotic world, they represent a crucial step in the long, slow, and often painful journey of human civilization. This journey was not a straight line. The principles laid down by Hammurabi were not universally adopted or even remembered. His empire eventually fell, and his famous stone pillar was carried off as war booty to another land, where it was eventually buried and lost to history for nearly 3,000 years. It was only rediscovered in the early 20th century, a silent monument to a forgotten legal world. Its rediscovery was a shock, a window into a form of social organization that was both highly sophisticated and utterly alien. It challenged the simplistic narratives of history that saw the past as a simple, primitive prelude to the present. The code showed that ancient peoples were capable of creating complex, comprehensive, and logically consistent systems of thought. The logic may not be our logic, but it is undeniably there. It is the logic of the accountant, the administrator, and the absolute monarch. It is a logic that sees society as a great machine, and the law as the set of instructions for its proper maintenance. If a part of the machine breaks, it is to be repaired or replaced according to the manual. If a human being breaks a rule, they too are to be repaired through fines or mutilation, or replaced through execution for the good of the whole. So when we settle in and think about these ancient laws, we are not just learning about a list of strange rules. We are trying to understand a different way of seeing the world. We are trying to inhabit a mindset in which the river can be a judge, in which a man's social rank is a tangible legal fact, and in which a broken contract is a greater threat to the world than a broken heart. It is an exercise in empathy, an attempt to bridge the vast gap of time and culture that separates us from the people who lived and died under the shadow of these unforgiving laws. The popular misunderstanding of the code as just an eye for an eye is a comforting simplification. It makes the past seem simple and easily digestible, but the reality is far more challenging and profound. The code was a complex instrument of social control, a tool for preserving a rigid hierarchy, and a brutally practical guide to resolving the conflicts that arose in a complex, urban, agricultural society. It was a world where justice was a commodity, distributed unevenly according to your birth and your wealth. Your life was governed by a relentless calculus of risk and reward, of duty and obligation. And yet, within this harsh framework, we can see the faint outlines of concepts that are still with us today. The idea that a written contract is binding, the distinction between intentional harm and an accident, the principle that professionals should be held accountable for their work, and the belief that the state has a responsibility to provide a system of justice for its people. These are the seeds from which later, more humane legal traditions would grow. The Code of Hammurabi is not the root of our own legal tree, but it is a picture of one of the very first forests. Let's step back from the specific laws for a moment and consider the man himself. Hammurabi presents himself in the prologue to his code not as a tyrant, but as a benevolent shepherd of his people. He claims the gods called him to make justice appear in the land, to destroy the evil and the wicked, that the strong might not oppress the weak. This is the classic language of the righteous king. He saw his laws not as instruments of oppression, but as a divine gift to his subjects, a way of protecting the vulnerable from the powerful. There is a profound and fascinating contradiction here. The king who claimed he wanted to protect the weak created a legal system that was explicitly biased in favor of the strong. The king who wanted to make justice appear in the land presided over a system where a nobleman could pay a fine for an act that would get a poor man executed. How do we resolve this? Perhaps Hammurabi did not see this as a contradiction. In his worldview, social hierarchy was a natural and divinely ordained part of a well-ordered society. Protecting the weak did not mean making them equal to the strong. It meant ensuring that they were not cheated or abused beyond what their station in life allowed. Justice, for Hammurabi, meant enforcing the established order of things. It meant ensuring that a nobleman was treated like a nobleman, that a commoner was treated like a commoner, and that a slave was treated like a slave. A crime, in this view, was not just an act of harm against an individual. It was an act that threatened to disrupt this delicate, fragile order. The punishments were so severe because the threat of chaos was so real. The code is the ultimate expression of a conservative worldview, one that values stability and order above all other virtues, including liberty, equality, or even compassion. As we listen to these stories of the builder and his son, the surgeon and his hands, the taverness and her customers, we can feel the texture of this lost world. We can feel the heat of the sun on the mud brick walls, hear the murmur of the marketplace, and sense the ever-present weight of the law, a force as powerful and as inescapable as the current of the great Euphrates River itself. We can begin to understand how a person could navigate this world, how they could find a way to live, work, and raise a family within this rigid and unforgiving system. The people of Babylon were not so different from us. They loved their children, feared disaster, and hoped for a prosperous life. But the framework of their existence, the set of rules that governed their every move, was fundamentally different from our own. To break a law in their world was to step off a narrow, clearly marked path and into a wilderness of terrifying and unpredictable consequences. It was to find yourself at the mercy of a system that saw you not as a unique individual, but as a piece on a great game board, a piece whose value and fate were determined by forces far beyond your control. This idea of the individual as a component in a larger social machine is perhaps the hardest for us to fully grasp. We are heirs to a tradition that places immense value on individual autonomy and personal freedom. The Code of Hammurabi represents the opposite philosophy. It is a philosophy of the collective, where the health of the hive is paramount and the fate of any individual bee is secondary. This is why the laws seem so impersonal, so focused on economic restitution and social balance, rather than on the emotional or psychological harm caused by a crime. This system was not designed to heal the victim's trauma. It was designed to repair the tear in the fabric of society as quickly and as efficiently as possible, often by creating a matching tear elsewhere. Let's consider the concept of professional responsibility one more time, but in a different context. Imagine a man who is not a builder or a doctor, but a boatman. His job is to ferry people and goods across the wide and often treacherous rivers. His boat is his livelihood, and his skill as a navigator is his most valuable asset. The law, of course, had specific rules for him. If he rented his boat to another man, he was still considered responsible for its upkeep. Law 236 states that if the boatman is careless and the boat sinks, he must replace it for the owner. This is the now familiar principle of professional liability. But the code went further, holding the boatman accountable not just for the vessel, but for everything inside it. A farmer hires a boatman to transport a precious cargo of grain down the river to the city market. The boatman loads the grain, but he is lazy. He doesn't caulk the seams of his boat properly or secure the cargo as he should. A storm comes up, the boat takes on water, and it sinks in the middle of the river. Not only is the boat lost, but the farmer's entire harvest, his income for the year, is now at the bottom of the Euphrates. Law 237 addresses this exact scenario. The boatman who has sunk the boat and lost its cargo shall replace the boat and all of the grain that he lost. He is financially responsible for the full value of everything that was destroyed due to his negligence. This created an immense pressure on the boatman to be diligent. Every journey was a financial risk. He was not just piloting a boat. He was the temporary guardian of his clients' livelihoods. This law is another perfect example of how the code sought to build trust in the economy. A farmer could feel secure in hiring a boatman, knowing that the law provided a powerful guarantee against incompetence. It incentivized the boatman to maintain his equipment and to navigate with the utmost care. The system was designed to weed out the lazy and the incompetent, ensuring that only the most responsible professionals could succeed. This practical, business-like approach to justice defined the entire legal landscape. This landscape was not just urban. The code reached far out into the countryside, into the orchards and groves that were a vital part of the agricultural economy. Date palms, in particular, were a hugely valuable resource, providing not only fruit but also fiber and wood. Managing a date grove was a skilled profession, often undertaken by a tenant farmer who would lease the land from a wealthy owner. The contract between the owner and the gardener was, naturally, the subject of detailed legal regulation. The law sought to create a fair arrangement that would motivate the gardener to be as productive as possible, while also ensuring the owner received his rightful share of the profits. The standard arrangement, described in laws 60 through 63, was a form of sharecropping. The tenant gardener did not pay a fixed rent in silver. Instead, he would give 2/3 of the date harvest to the owner of the grove, keeping 1/3 for himself as payment for his labor. This was a clever system. It meant that both the owner and the gardener had a shared interest in producing the largest possible harvest. The harder the gardener worked, the more dates he would get for himself, and the more the owner would receive as well. It was a partnership, with the risks and rewards shared between them. But the law also had to account for the possibility of a lazy or unproductive gardener. What if the gardener neglected his duties? What if he failed to pollinate the palms properly, or allowed the irrigation channels to run dry, resulting in a poor harvest? Law 62 addresses this. If the gardener does not cause the garden to bear fruit and diminishes the yield, he is still obligated to pay the owner his share. But since the actual harvest is small, the law required the gardener to pay based on the yield of the neighboring gardens. The judges would look at the harvest of the diligent farmers nearby and calculate what the garden should have produced. The lazy gardener had to pay his 2/3 share based on that theoretical average yield, likely forcing him into debt to make up the difference. This neighbor's yield principle is another example of the code's practical genius. It created an objective, community-based standard of productivity. A gardener could not make excuses for a poor harvest if all of his neighbors were successful. It was a powerful tool against negligence, ensuring that the owner's valuable land would not be allowed to go to waste through the incompetence of a tenant. The law was a constant, invisible supervisor, pushing every worker to meet the standards of their community, whether they were tending a date palm, steering a boat, or laying bricks for a house. The entire kingdom was a web of such responsibilities, with every person's performance measured against a clear and often unforgiving legal standard. This standard even applied to the most basic forms of property rental. Imagine you are a Babylonian who owns a house but you live elsewhere. You decide to rent it out to a tenant for a standard yearly fee. The contract is simple and is recorded on a clay tablet. The tenant pays his rent on time, and for a while all is well. But the tenant is not a good caretaker of your property. He allows the roof to leak and does not make basic repairs. Over time, the house falls into a state of disrepair. The code held the landlord, not the tenant, ultimately responsible for the structural integrity of the house. Law 39 states the landlord must keep the house in good repair. But the tenant also had obligations. If the landlord provided the tenant with the necessary materials for repair, reeds, clay, and wood, and the tenant failed to use them, he could be held liable for any resulting damage. The law sought to create a balance of responsibility. This legal framework for renting property feels surprisingly modern. It establishes the duties of both the landlord and the tenant, creating a predictable system for resolving disputes. However, the system also had a darker side, especially when it came to debt. If a tenant fell behind on his rent, the landlord had a powerful and terrifying tool at his disposal: the right of distraint. This meant the landlord could legally seize the tenant's property from within the house as payment for the overdue rent. This could include furniture, tools, or even the grain the tenant needed to feed his family. Law 113, however, placed a crucial limit on this practice. It was designed to prevent a landlord from abusing his power and causing the death of his tenant's family. The law specifically addresses the seizure of a tenant's grain supply. It states that if a landlord takes the tenant's grain without the tenant's consent, and this leads to the starvation of the tenant's family, the landlord is guilty of a grave crime. He must return all the grain he seized, and, quote, because he caused the death of the tenant's household by starvation, he himself shall be put to death. This is a shocking and powerful law. It shows that while the code was obsessed with protecting property rights, it was not completely blind to human consequences. It recognized that there were limits. A landlord's right to collect his debt ended where a family's right to survive began. To seize a family's last reserve of food was not seen as a legitimate business practice. It was seen as a form of murder, and it was punished as such. This law is a rare glimpse of a kind of social conscience within the otherwise ruthless logic of the code. It suggests a belief that even in the pursuit of a legal debt, There was a line that could not be crossed, a point at which economic justice had to give way to basic human preservation. The code's intricate rules also extended to the practice of medicine, which in Babylon was a blend of empirical observation, magic, and religion. A physician, or ASU, was a respected craftsman who dealt in herbal remedies, salves, and minor surgery. We've already seen the terrifying consequences for a surgeon who failed while operating on a nobleman. But the code also set the prices for their successful work, creating a sliding scale of fees based, once again, on the patient's social status. This was not a free market for healthcare. It was a state-regulated system where the value of a cure was explicitly tied to the value of the person being cured. Law 215, as we noted, set the price for a successful eye surgery on a nobleman at a handsome 10 shekels of silver. Law 216 sets the price for the exact same successful surgery on a commoner at 5 shekels of silver. And Law 217 sets the price for curing a slave at just 2 shekels of silver, paid to the slave's master, not to the slave. This fee schedule is a perfect microcosm of the Babylonian worldview. A nobleman's health was worth twice that of a commoner and 5 times that of a slave. The doctor's skill was a constant, but its market value was entirely dependent on the social rank of the person it was applied to. The code even set the fees for more mundane treatments. Law 221 states that if a physician heals a broken bone or cures a diseased muscle for a nobleman, he receives 5 shekels of silver. For a commoner, the fee was 3 shekels. For a slave, it was 2 shekels, paid to the master. The message was clear and consistent. Every aspect of life, from your legal rights to your medical bills, was filtered through the lens of social class. There was no pretense of equality. The system was designed to be unequal, to reflect what the Babylonians saw as the natural and proper ordering of the world, an order that was sanctioned by the gods and enforced by the king. This relentless focus on hierarchy and order can make the world of Hammurabi seem static and oppressive. It was certainly not a world that encouraged social mobility. You were born into a class, and you were likely to die in that class. Your opportunities, your rights, and your value were largely determined at birth. Yet within this rigid structure, life went on. People fell in love, raised families, ran businesses, and told stories. The code was the hard, unyielding bedrock on which their lives were built, a constant presence that shaped their decisions and defined their relationships. It was the operating system of their civilization, a program that ran silently in the background of every human interaction. One of the most fascinating aspects of this operating system is how it dealt with situations that seem, to us, to be matters of personal morality rather than legal regulation. Consider the act of divorce. We've seen how the law handled it as a contractual and financial matter, but it also delved into the specific behaviors that could justify a divorce. A husband could divorce a wife who wasted her house, but what did that mean in practice? Clay tablets from the period suggest it could mean anything from poor financial management to frequenting the public square and gossiping, behavior that was seen as undignified and a threat to the family's reputation. A woman's public behavior was a matter of legal concern. The code also offers a strange and revealing glimpse into the legal status of women through the laws concerning alewives or female tavern keepers. We know she could be executed for harboring conspirators or for cheating her customers, but the very fact that these laws exist shows that it was possible for a woman to be an independent business owner, a public figure with legal responsibilities. While most women's lives were defined by their roles as daughters, wives, and mothers within the patriarchal household, the code acknowledges that other paths were possible. The alewife, the priestess, the wet nurse, these were recognized professions for women, each with its own set of rights and, as we've seen, its own terrifying set of duties. The role of the priestess is particularly interesting. Certain classes of priestesses, known as naditu, were not allowed to marry or have children. They lived in a cloistered community associated with the temple. These women were often from wealthy families, and they were major players in the Babylonian economy. They could own property, conduct business, and make contracts. They were powerful, independent women. However, their special status came with strict social restrictions. Law 110, which we touched on earlier, stated that a priestess who even entered a tavern could be burned to death. Her sacred status demanded a level of public piety that was enforced with the most extreme prejudice. This law highlights the deep connection between religion and the state in Babylon. The gods were not just objects of worship. They were major landowners and key players in the economy. The temples were vast commercial enterprises. Therefore, an insult to the religious order was also an insult to the economic and political order. A priestess drinking in a public tavern was not just a personal failing. It was an act that tarnished the reputation of the temple she served, and by extension, the god of that temple. The punishment was so severe because the crime was seen as a form of sacrilege, a stain on the sacred fabric of the community that had to be cleansed with fire. This fusion of the sacred and the secular is one of the keys to understanding the code. Modern societies try to build a wall between church and state, between religious law and civil law. In Babylon, no such wall existed. The king's authority came from the gods. The river ordeal placed legal judgment in the hands of a river deity. Oaths sworn in a temple were considered binding legal evidence. The laws themselves, according to Hammurabi's own words, were given to him by the sun god Shamash, the patron of justice. To break the king's law was to defy the will of the gods, and to defy the gods was to threaten the very foundations of the world. So when we ask, what if you broke a law under Hammurabi's code? The answer is more complex than just a description of a punishment. To break a law was to commit an act of cosmic rebellion. It was to create an imbalance in a carefully ordered universe. The punishment that followed was not just a penalty, it was a ritual of restoration. When the negligent builder's son was put to death, it was to restore the balance lost by the death of the homeowner's son. When the false witness was executed, it was to restore the balance he had tried to upset with his lie. When the corrupt judge was disgraced, it was to restore the purity of the king's justice. This worldview can seem fatalistic. It suggests a universe governed by rigid, unforgiving rules, where human beings are largely puppets of a grand cosmic design. There is little room for grace, forgiveness, or second chances. The code is a document of consequences, not of redemption. If you made a mistake, you paid the price. If you were unlucky, you paid the price. The system was designed to be relentless, to grind on with a mechanical and impersonal logic. It offered the cold comfort of predictability, but it demanded the sacrifice of individual freedom and compassion. And yet we must not forget the prologue and epilogue of the great Stella. In these poetic passages, Hammurabi frames his laws as a great act of paternal love for his people. He calls himself the son of Babylon, a king who brings light and life to his subjects. He claims his goal is that justice should shine in the land, and that the strong should not harm the weak. He intended his laws to be a monument to his just rule, a legacy that would ensure the well-being of his people for all time. He invites any oppressed man who has a case to come and stand before his image and have the law read to him, so that he may, quote, understand his case and let his heart be relieved. This is the great paradox of Hammurabi's code. It is a document that is simultaneously a tool of brutal social control and a testament to a king's aspiration to be a just and righteous ruler. It is a legal system that enshrined inequality as a core principle, yet claimed to be a shield for the weak. It is a monument to a worldview that is both deeply alien and hauntingly familiar in its attempt to impose human order on a chaotic world. The tension between the code's lofty rhetoric and its often horrifying practical application is what makes it such an endlessly fascinating and important document. When we strip away all the details about oxen, date groves, and priestesses, we are left with a set of fundamental questions. What is the purpose of law? Is it to protect individual rights or to ensure collective stability? Is justice about equality or about maintaining a social order? Should punishment be about rehabilitation or retribution? The Code of Hammurabi provides one set of answers to these questions, answers that are stark, uncompromising, and deeply challenging to our modern sensibilities. It serves as a mirror, reflecting a different path that human society could have taken and in some ways did take for thousands of years. The feeling of living under such a system would be one of profound embeddedness. You would not think of yourself as an individual first and foremost. You would be a member of a family, a resident of a city, a subject of a king, and a servant of the gods. Your identity would be defined by your relationships and your obligations. Your life would be a performance of a prescribed role, and the code would be your script. To deviate from the script was to risk not just punishment, but a kind of social death, a loss of the very identity that connected you to the world around you. This script was not just a set of prohibitions. It was a guide to right living, as defined by the state. A good Babylonian citizen was one who maintained his property, honored his contracts, respected his superiors, and fulfilled his duties to his family and the king. The law was a tool for creating a specific kind of person, a person who was diligent, obedient, and predictable. The code was an engine for producing the ideal subjects that a centralized, bureaucratic empire required to function. It was a form of social engineering on a grand scale, an attempt to shape human behavior to fit the needs of the state. So as we drift off to sleep, we can imagine this world in all its vivid and often brutal detail. We can see the farmer anxiously inspecting his dike by moonlight, the merchant swearing an oath in the dim light of the temple, the judge unrolling a clay tablet to read a verdict that will change a life forever. We can feel the immense weight of a system where every action had a clear and often permanent consequence. It was a world without ambiguity, a world of harsh certainties carved in stone. It was the world that Hammurabi built, and its echoes can still be heard, faintly, in the legal codes and social contracts that govern our own lives today. The code's influence is not always direct or obvious, but the fundamental idea that a society should be governed by a written, public set of laws is a legacy that traces back to these early experiments in civilization. The Babylonian scribe, pressing his reed stylus into a tablet of wet clay to record a marriage contract or a loan agreement, was participating in a revolution. He was cementing a human interaction in a form that could outlast memory, a form that could be appealed to in a court of law. This act of writing things down was a powerful technology, a way of creating a shared, objective reality that could bind people together in a complex society. This reliance on the written word had a profound impact on how justice was administered. It meant that a case was not just a matter of who could tell the most convincing story. It was a matter of evidence. A clay tablet with a sealed contract was a powerful piece of proof. A recorded warning from the ward council about a dangerous ox could be the difference between life and death. This is the beginning of a legal tradition based on documentation and evidence, a move away from the purely oral traditions of the past. The code, in this sense, was not just a list of laws. It was a celebration of the power of writing itself to create order and certainty. This certainty, however, came at a cost. The written law can be inflexible. It may not be able to account for the unique circumstances of a particular case. A law that says if a man breaks into a house he shall be killed leaves no room for the judge to consider why the man broke in. Was he a malicious thief or a starving man desperate to feed his family? The code, for the most part, did not care about motive. The act itself was the crime. This is a hallmark of early legal systems. They are focused on the deed, not the intent. The more nuanced legal concept of mens rea, or the guilty mind, would take many more centuries to fully develop. So, if you were that starving man who broke into a house for a loaf of bread, You would be judged by the same harsh standard as a professional burglar. Your desperation would be legally irrelevant. The law would see only the broken wall and the stolen property. Your punishment would be the same: death, and your body walled up in the breach you created. This is perhaps the cruelest aspect of the code. It is a system with very little room for mercy. It was designed to be a blunt instrument, to enforce order through fear and overwhelming force, not through a compassionate understanding of human weakness. This lack of compassion is also evident in the laws regarding family. A son who strikes his father has his hand cut off. A wife who wants to leave a marriage because her husband has belittled her risks being thrown into the river if the court does not believe her. An adopted son who seeks out his birth family can have his tongue or eye cut out. These laws were not designed to foster loving and harmonious family relationships. They were designed to enforce a rigid hierarchy and to protect the integrity of the family as an economic and social unit. The father's authority was absolute, and any challenge to it was treated as a form of treason against the natural order. It is tempting to judge these people harshly, to see them as monsters of cruelty. But that would be to miss the point. The Babylonians were not more cruel than any other people of their time. They were simply trying to solve the fundamental problem of how to live together in large numbers without descending into constant violence and chaos. Their solution was a system of absolute order, where every person had a place and a set of rules to follow. The punishments were harsh because the alternative, the lawlessness and blood feuds of the past, was seen as a far greater evil. The code was the price they were willing to pay for civilization. This price was paid most heavily by those at the bottom of the social ladder: the slave, the commoner, the poor farmer. These were the people who felt the full, crushing weight of the law with the fewest protections. A nobleman had his status and his wealth to shield him. He could pay a fine for an assault that would cost another man his tooth. He could afford the tenfold penalty for theft that would get a poor man executed. The law, in practice, was a tool for the powerful to manage the powerless. It created a society that was stable, yes, but also one that was fundamentally and intentionally unjust by our modern standards. And what of Hammurabi himself? Did he truly believe his own rhetoric? Did he see himself as a great protector of the weak, even as he promulgated laws that valued their lives so little? It is impossible to know for sure, but it is likely that he saw no contradiction. He was a king of his time, and his worldview was shaped by the brutal realities of the ancient world. He was building an empire, and empires are built on order, hierarchy, and control. His code was the ultimate tool for achieving those goals. It was a work of political genius, a masterpiece of social engineering that helped to make his kingdom one of the greatest of its age. The world that the code describes is a world that is both brilliantly complex and brutally simple. It is complex in its detailed regulations for every aspect of life, from medicine to agriculture to family law. It is simple in its underlying logic: a place for everyone, and everyone in their place, a rule for every action, and a punishment for every transgression, a price for every limb, and a value for every life. It is a world that is internally consistent, a system that, on its own terms, makes a kind of terrible sense. It is the product of a powerful and orderly mind, a mind that sought to impose its will on the messy, unpredictable reality of human existence. The true brutal truth of Hammurabi's code is not just that the punishments were harsh. It is that the entire system was built on a foundation of inherent, legally mandated inequality. The myth is that it was a simple system of an eye for an eye. The reality is that it was a complex system of price tags, where the value of your eye, your tooth, your labor, and your life was determined by your social class. Your experience of justice in Babylon would depend entirely on who you were. The law was not a blindfolded goddess holding a balanced scale. She was a sharp-eyed merchant, carefully weighing the worth of every soul who came before her. This merchant-like quality of the law is perhaps its most defining feature. Almost every crime could be reduced to a question of economic value. A broken bone was worth a certain amount of silver. A ruined harvest was worth a specific quantity of grain. A dead slave was a financial loss to be compensated. This transformed the legal system into a giant, kingdom-wide accounting ledger. A crime created a debt, and the punishment was the method of payment. Sometimes the payment was in silver, sometimes in flesh, but the principle was the same. The books had to be balanced. This is why the laws about false testimony and corrupt judges were so severe. A false witness or a corrupt judge was not just harming an individual, they were tampering with the ledger. They were cooking the books of the entire civilization. This was an existential threat to the system itself, and it had to be punished with the utmost severity to preserve the faith of the people in the integrity of the accounting. The entire edifice of Babylonian society rested on the belief that the numbers on the great cosmic ledger were, in the end, accurate. As we look back one last time at the vignettes of life under the code, we see a common thread. The builder, the surgeon, the tavernist, the farmer, the shepherd. They are all professionals whose work has a direct impact on the community. The code is intensely focused on regulating these professions. It is a system designed for an interdependent society, where the failure of one person can have a ripple effect that harms many others. The law was the mechanism for managing this interdependence, for ensuring that each part of the social machine performed its function correctly, lest the entire structure collapse. This focus on professional responsibility is one of the code's most enduring legacies. The idea that a person who holds a position of public trust or skill has a special duty of care is a principle that is still central to our own legal and ethical systems. We may not threaten to cut off a surgeon's hands, but we do hold them to a very high standard of competence, and there are severe legal and professional consequences for failure. The seeds of this idea that your professional status comes with a heightened level of responsibility can be seen clearly in these ancient laws. Ultimately, the Code of Hammurabi is a document that is both deeply admirable and deeply disturbing. It is admirable in its ambition, its complexity, and its attempt to create a stable society based on the rule of law. It is disturbing in its cruelty, its inequality, and its casual disregard for human life and liberty. It is a powerful reminder that the concept of justice is not a timeless absolute. It is a cultural creation, shaped by the values, beliefs, and power structures of the society that produces it. The justice of Hammurabi's Babylon is not our justice, and in understanding that difference, we can better understand ourselves. The romanticized myth of a simple, fair, eye for an eye system is comforting because it aligns with our modern ideas of equality. The brutal reality is that Hammurabi's code was a legal tool designed to preserve a deeply unequal society. It was a masterpiece of social control, not a charter of human rights. To live under it was to know your place, to understand your price, and to live with the constant knowledge that a single mistake, your own or someone else's, could bring the full, terrifying weight of the law down upon you and your family. It was a world of order, but it was an order built on a foundation of fear. And it is this atmosphere of fear and caution that would have been the most pervasive feeling of daily life. It was not the fear of random chaos, but the fear of a predictable and inescapable system. You knew the rules of the game. You knew the penalties for losing. This knowledge would have shaped every decision you made, from how you built a wall to what you said in a tavern. It was a system that demanded constant vigilance, a world where a moment of carelessness could be your last. This was the price of living in one of the world's first great civilizations. The journey from a simple pop culture slogan to a deeper understanding of this complex legal world shows us the true value of history. It challenges our assumptions, complicates our narratives, and forces us to confront the profound differences in human experience across time. The world of Hammurabi is not a simple morality play. It is a rich and challenging case study in the eternal human struggle to create order, meaning, and justice in a difficult and often unforgiving world. The solutions they found are not ours, but the struggle itself is one that we can and should recognize. So the next time you hear the phrase, an eye for an eye, you can remember the full story. You can remember the nobleman, the commoner, and the slave, and the different prices paid for their pain. You can remember the builder whose son's life hung in the balance, and the surgeon whose hands were on the line. You can remember the woman accused of a crime, walking towards the river that would be her judge, her jury, and her executioner. You can remember the intricate and often cruel machinery of one of humanity's first great attempts to write down the rules of civilization. This journey into the past is not just about learning facts. It is about feeling the weight of a different reality. It is about understanding that the world we inhabit, with its particular ideas about rights, justice, and equality, is not an inevitability. It is the product of a long, complex, and often brutal history. The world of Hammurabi stands as a powerful testament to that fact, a silent witness carved in black stone, waiting in the quiet of a museum to tell its stories to those who are willing to listen. The story of what would happen if you broke a law under Hammurabi's code is not one story, but many. It is a story of status, of property, and of power. It is a story that reveals a society's deepest anxieties and its most cherished values. In the end, the most shocking thing about the code is not its brutality, but its cold, rational, and internally consistent logic. It is a vision of a perfectly ordered world and a chilling reminder of the price that such an order can demand.